Act 1. The Board Before the First Move. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Refused to Be a Pawn. Issei had been dead for 3 minutes and 47 seconds before he decided that dying was, on balance, an extraordinarily inefficient use of his time. He lay in the grass of Ko Academy's back courtyard with a spear of crimson light dissolving through his chest. The cool October sky stretched above him like a canvas that someone had forgotten to paint anything important on. Fallen angel wings beat the air somewhere above his head. He could hear Rainier speaking, voice dripping with the particular contempt that beautiful people reserve for those they have already discarded. Such a waste, she said. Humans with sacred gears are always so disappointingly fragile. Issei did not feel fragile. He felt annoyed. This was, perhaps, unusual for someone in his condition. Most people, when dying, experience fear, or grief, or a panoramic review of their most cherished memories. Issei experienced the mental equivalent of a chess player staring at a board position he had walked directly into, and thinking, "How did I not see that coming?" He had catalogued the warning signs for weeks. Yuma Amano had appeared in his life the way a mirage appears in a desert, perfect and inexplicable and available in ways that made no logical sense. She had asked him out on a date with the casual confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. She had smiled too precisely. Her emotions had carried the faint mechanical quality of a performance reviewed and rehearsed. He had noted all of this. He had filed it away in the organized architecture of his mind, the mental space he privately called the board, where every piece of relevant information about a situation got arranged into a coherent strategic picture. And then he had gone on the date anyway, because he was 16 and she was beautiful, and some part of him had desperately wanted to be wrong. He had not been wrong. He was almost never wrong. This was something he had been told was a positive quality until he had discovered that being correct about unpleasant things felt almost identical to being wrong. The spear of light pulsed in his chest. He could feel something in his left hand, a warmth that did not belong to his slowly cooling body, a pressure that felt like a gauntlet being fitted over his skin by invisible hands. The sacred gear. Boosted gear. He had read about it in one of the 3 occult reference books he had quietly acquired from the school library's storage room after noticing, 3 months ago, that the Occult Research Club's members occasionally moved faster than human musculature should permit, and once, memorably, that their club president's shadow had briefly appeared to have 6 wings. He had not joined the club. He had instead spent those 3 months watching, and reading, and building a picture of Koa's supernatural architecture from the outside. He had been waiting for a moment to understand what he was before he stepped onto a board he could not yet see clearly. The moment had arrived somewhat ahead of schedule. "Drake," Issei said to the warmth in his hand. His voice came out surprisingly steady. "I know you can hear me. The legends were quite specific about your nature as a partner consciousness. I have a proposal." Silence. Then, from somewhere that was not quite inside him and not quite outside, a presence stirred. Ancient. Tired. Faintly amused. "You are dying," the Dragon Emperor said. Most hosts use their final moments for something other than proposals. Most hosts probably haven't spent 3 months preparing for this conversation. I know what the boosted gear does. I know what your power costs. I know that a standard boost probably can't overcome a fallen angel's light spear at close range before I bleed out. Issei paused. But I also know that you have been waiting for a partner worth waking up for. Every legend about you describes someone who fought, but none of them describes someone who thought. I'd like to offer you that, if you're interested. Another silence. Longer this time. "You are not frightened," Drake observed. "I'm terrified," Issei said honestly. "But fear is information, not instruction. I don't let it make decisions." The warmth in his hand exploded into something vast and red and roaring, and Issei stopped being dead. The devil girl arrived in a scatter of crimson petals that smelled of summer roses and ozone. Issei had expected Rias Gremory. He had catalogued her as well. President of the Occult Research Club. 3rd year. Heir to the House of Gremory, one of the 72 pillars of devil nobility. Hair the color of Drake's power, and eyes the shade of deep water. She moved through the school with the unhurried certainty of someone who understood precisely how much space in the world she was entitled to occupy. He had also noted, without allowing himself to be distracted by it, that she was one of the most beautiful people he had ever seen. He had filed this information in the same mental compartment as the information that the sky was blue and that fire was hot. Accurate, relevant to certain practical calculations, and not something to be made decisions based on. She knelt beside him in the grass, and her expression was one he had not predicted. Not the cool assessment of a chess player evaluating a piece. Not the practiced sympathy of a superior addressing a subordinate. She looked at him with something that was almost personal, almost urgent, like someone discovering that a thing they had been watching from a distance was, after all, irreplaceable. Issei Hayadu, she said. I can save you. But the method of salvation comes with conditions that deserve honesty before you accept them. He liked that. He had not expected that. Tell me, he said. You would die and be reborn as a devil. A member of my peerage. Under the system of evil pieces, you would be assigned a role that reflects your perceived value and function. She paused, and something flickered behind her eyes. You would become a pawn. Issei was quiet for a moment. Above him, the stars were very clear. I'd like to make a counter-proposal, he said. Rias blinked. In 11 years of dealing with supernatural beings, and in the 4 years since she had begun building her peerage, no one had ever responded to the offer of salvation with a counter-proposal. You are dying, she pointed out. Yes. I'm aware. I have approximately 90 seconds of useful consciousness remaining, so I'll be concise. He turned his head to look at her. I will accept reincarnation. I will serve in your peerage. I will give you everything I have, which is, if you'll permit me to say so without sounding arrogant, considerably more than most pawns offer. But I won't be a pawn in the strategic sense. Not a piece that advances and waits to be promoted. I want a different role. Not on the board. Behind it. Behind it, Rias repeated. I want to build your strategy. Not just follow orders but design the entire approach. I've been watching your peerage for 3 months. You have extraordinary individual pieces and almost no coherent coordination between them. Akino executes brilliantly in isolation. Kaneko is devastating in a direct confrontation but telegraphs. Yudo has speed and technique but holds back in ways that read as emotional hesitation. You yourself fight with power that should be overwhelming, but you approach engagements reactively rather than proactively. He coughed, and blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, and he continued anyway. You're playing each piece separately when you could be playing a combination. I can build you combinations. Sequences. Plans 12 moves deep. That is what I am offering in exchange for not being a pawn. Rias Gremery stared at him for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she laughed. It was not the practiced social laugh she deployed in the hallways of Ko Academy. It was something smaller and more genuine, surprised out of her by a situation she had not prepared for. What should I call your role, then? She asked. If not pawn, Grandmaster, Issei said. The player who manages all the pieces is always off the board. She placed her hand over his chest, where the light spear had done its work, and the crimson power of the House of Gremery flooded into him like a second sunrise. Grandmaster, Rias agreed. Welcome to my peerage, Issei Hayadu. He let his eyes close. In the space between dying and being reborn, on the board behind his closed eyes, he began to plan. Chapter 2, The Architecture of a Peerage. Issei spent his first 3 days as a devil asleep, which was, as Akino Himejima informed him with a smile that somehow managed to be both warm and faintly dangerous, entirely normal. Reincarnation is not a gentle process, she said, setting a cup of tea on the table beside his head. She moved through the Occult Research Club's room with the ease of someone who had arranged the furniture herself, and knew the exact path between every obstacle. Your body was clinically dead. The evil pieces had to rebuild considerably. You should be grateful for the sleep. I was reviewing strategic scenarios, Issei said. Akino's smile did not waver, but something shifted in her violet eyes. In your sleep? It's how I process. I go over a problem until the patterns settle. By the time I woke up, I had a reasonably complete picture of the structural weaknesses in standard peerage combat formations. He sat up, and the room resolved itself around him. Old architecture, high ceilings, the smell of old books, and something sweet that might have been the residue of magical workings or might have been Akino's tea. Afternoon light fell through tall windows. How many raiding games has this peerage participated in? 3, said a different voice. Issei turned. Kibayuto sat in one of the leather chairs near the window, an open book balanced on his knee with the careful posture of someone who had learned to be comfortable in every environment without ever quite relaxing. He was watching Issei with an expression that was cautious and not unfriendly. We have won 1. Lost 1. The third ended in a draw when our opponent's queen was forced to yield following a 17-minute standoff. What was our win rate per individual engagement? A pause. I don't know that we've tracked it that way. We should start. Issei swung his legs off the couch. He was wearing clothes that were not his own, which he noted without comment, filing it under logistics to address later. Before I can design a strategy for future games, I need a complete picture of every past engagement. Who fought whom? What techniques were used? What the outcomes were? What went wrong in the losses? What went right in the wins? I'd like to review all of it by the end of this week. From the doorway someone said, "You're already working?" Rias Gremery stood in the entrance to the club room with a stack of folders under one arm and an expression that was somewhere between impressed and amused. She was wearing the Ko Academy uniform rather than anything that marked her supernatural status, and this mundane detail struck Issei as a deliberate choice. She moved between worlds easily, wearing each one as a comfortable costume. "You told me to start thinking," he said. "I started. I told you that 3 days ago, and you were technically unconscious. I processed during unconsciousness." He held out his hand for the folders. "Are those the game records?" She looked at him for a moment with that same expression he had catalogued from the courtyard, the look of someone discovering that a thing they had been watching from a distance was, after all, genuinely surprising. Then she handed him the folders. He opened the first one and began to read. By the end of that first week, Issei had covered the long table at the center of the clubroom in color-coded index cards. Each card represented a variable. Blue for terrain. Red for known enemy techniques. Green for his own peerage's demonstrated capabilities. Yellow for observed behavioral patterns, the tendencies that opponents developed from habit, and could be predicted and exploited. Black for what he called structural unknowns, the gaps in the picture where he lacked sufficient data to make confident predictions. There were more black cards than he liked. "This is," Kaneko Tuja said, appearing silently at his elbow in the way that she had apparently made a personal specialty, "a lot." "This is preliminary," Issei said. "When I'm finished, it'll be significantly more." Kaneko stared at the table. She was small and white-haired and possessed of the particular stillness that Issei had come to associate with genuinely dangerous things. The stillness of something that has no need to signal its capability because its capability is not in question. In their one conversation thus far she had spoken 14 words to him. He had noted each one carefully. Her economy with language was not shyness. It was precision. "What does this one mean?" she said, touching a yellow card that read, "KT holds last 15%. "Why? That's you?" "I observed that in every recorded combat sequence, you hold back approximately 15% of your demonstrated strength at maximum output. I don't yet know why. It might be a conscious tactical choice, in which case I want to know the logic. It might be an unconscious limiter, in which case we should investigate." He looked at her directly. "It's not a criticism. It's a question. Understanding the pattern helps me work with it." Kaneko was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes unreadable. "I'll think about it," she said finally, which was, he was beginning to understand, as close as Kaneko Tuja came to saying yes. Rias found him still at the table at 11 o'clock that night. "You should sleep," she said. "You've been recently dead. Your body needs more recovery time than you seem willing to give it." "I sleep when the problem settles," Issei said. "It hasn't settled yet." She sat down across from him, on the other side of the table covered in its architecture of cards and connections. In the lamplight her hair was the color of dried roses, and she looked at his arrangement with the focused attention she gave everything she chose to spend time on. "Tell me what you see," she said. He leaned back. I see a peerage with extraordinary raw capability and almost no coordinated depth. Every one of your members is individually exceptional. Akino is one of the most powerful queens I've read about in any historical game record. Her lightning techniques have a range and precision that should be nearly impossible to counter directly. Yuto's sword style is faster than I can fully track, and he has the spatial intelligence to work three-dimensional angles that most opponents can't anticipate. You yourself have the power of destruction, which is, from a pure numbers perspective, frankly unfair. And yet we've lost, Rias said, because you fight like 5 individual players sharing a board instead of like a single mind with 5 hands. He reached out and moved a blue card. In the game you lost, against the Citri peerage, your formation collapsed in the middle game because Yuto and Akino occupied overlapping fields of engagement. They were effective individually and counterproductive together. Sona's Citri identified this and exploited it within the first 6 minutes. You analyze Sona's strategy from written records? She's very good. She thinks 3 moves ahead and she builds her advantage through resource management rather than direct confrontation. Against an uncoordinated opponent, that's devastating, because she doesn't need to win fights. She just needs to make your fights expensive. He paused. Against a coordinated opponent, her approach has a vulnerability. She can be surprised. She relies on opponents behaving predictably, and she's rarely faced one who would make choices outside the probable range. Rias looked at him with an expression he was not entirely sure he knew how to catalog. When I offered you a place in my peerage, she said quietly, I thought I understood what I was doing. I have good instincts for people. I thought, here is a boy with an extraordinary sacred gear and a mind that seems clear. A worthy pawn. I'm not a pawn, Issei said. No. A small smile. You're something I don't have a category for yet. That is, I find, rather exciting. She stood, straightening her skirt with the composed efficiency of someone who keeps their gestures exactly as large as they need to be. The index cards are good. When you have a complete picture, I want a full briefing. All of us. Together. I'll need 2 more weeks, he said. You have them. She moved toward the door, then paused, looking back over her shoulder in the lamplight. Issei. The fact that you counter-proposed from a dying position in a courtyard is something I have not told anyone. I mention this because I think the quality of a strategist depends partly on the quality of their information security. He looked at her. I appreciate that. Also, she said, and something in her voice shifted to something quieter, I am glad you suggested an alternative to dying. The raiding games are important to me. But they are not, I want to be clear, the reason I reincarnated you. She left before he could formulate a response, which was, he thought, excellent strategic timing on her part. He turned back to the table. On the board in his mind, a new card had appeared in a position he had not planned for. He stared at it for a moment, uncertain which color to assign it. He filed it temporarily under structural unknowns and went back to work. Chapter 3, The First Forgotten Piece. Issei found her on a Saturday morning in the old district of Ko, in the space between a dry cleaning establishment and a shuttered flower shop, sitting on a storm drain with her wings folded tight against her back and a half-eaten rice ball in one hand. He had been looking for her for 4 days. The data had come from 3 separate sources, which he cross-referenced before trusting any of them, a fragment of an old supernatural census that Rias kept in the clubroom's reference library, a patrol report from Asia Argento, newly returned from her encounter with Rias's peerage and now a tentative ally. Curious and kind and possessed of a healing ability that Issei had immediately flagged as strategically invaluable, and a brief, almost throwaway observation from Kaneko that someone, smelling of old magic, had been sleeping near the river. Harpy. Female. Approximately 160 years old, which made her a young adult by Harpy reckoning. Last registered address. A mountain range in northern Greece that had been razed by a supernatural conflict 40 years ago in a war between 2 noble devil houses. Status, unclaimed. Unaffiliated. What the supernatural world called, with a casualness that Issei found quietly enraging, a stray. The girl on the storm drain had dusty brown feathers along her forearms where human girls would have skin, and the particular sharp-eyed attention of something designed by evolution to track movement from very high altitude. When she heard his footsteps she went rigid, and the rice ball disappeared somewhere into the folds of her jacket with a speed that reminded him sharply of Kaneko. "I'm not with the fallen angels," he said before she could move. She was already calculating escape routes. He could see it in her eyes, the rapid flick between the two available alleys and the fire escape. He had deliberately approached from the one angle that left the fire escape accessible, because blocking every exit was a threat, and he was not here to threaten. "Or the devils," she said. Her voice was rougher than he had expected, accented with something old and mountainous. "You feel like a devil. I am one." Recently. He sat down on the opposite storm drain with the care of someone demonstrating that he had no intention of moving quickly. "My name is Issei Hayadu. I'm the strategist for the Gremry Peerage in Co territory. I've been looking for you specifically because I think you have abilities that would be useful to our team, and because you have been living in a drain for at least 3 weeks, and that seems like a bad situation that I might be able to improve." The harpy stared at him. "Most devils who find strays try to press gang them," she said. "I'm aware. I find that approach both ethically questionable and strategically inefficient. Coerced allegiance produces unreliable performance." He folded his hands in his lap. "I'm here to make an offer. If you're not interested, I'll leave and you won't hear from me again. But I'd like to explain the offer first, if you'll let me." A long silence. The dry cleaning establishment hummed. Somewhere down the block a bicycle bell rang twice. "What's your name?" he asked. "Zephyrine," she said, after a pause that suggested she was deciding whether to tell him. Zeph. I've been reading about harpy combat techniques. The wind manipulation is theoretically capable of things that I don't think any current peerage is using effectively. Specifically, I'm interested in the layered air pressure columns that harpy elders can construct, the ones that redirect projectiles. In a raiding game context, against an opponent who relies heavily on ranged attacks, that capability would be nearly game-breaking if properly positioned. He paused. "Can you do that? The pressure columns?" Something shifted in her expression. Not quite pride. Something more guarded than pride, the look of someone who has been told their capabilities are not valuable so many times that they have stopped expecting otherwise. "I'm not an elder," she said. "I know. But you're showing the early development of the technique in the thermal management around your feathers right now, which suggests the potential is there." He had noted the faint shimmer around her wing feathers the moment he had walked within range. The air near her moved in patterns that were not entirely random. Elders develop it over centuries. You're 160. The foundation is already present. With practice and the right application context, I think you could develop something functional within 6 months. She stared at him with the piercing altitude-designed focus of her species. "Why would you spend 6 months developing a stray harpy," she said, "when you could recruit an established supernatural fighter from any number of available sources?" "Because established supernatural fighters from available sources have established habits and established limitations. You're something nobody has built a defense against yet." He met her gaze directly. "Also, because you're eating a rice ball alone on a storm drain, and you deserve a better situation than that, and both of those things are true at once." Zephyrine was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "What's the catch? You joined the Gremry Peerage formally. You'd train consistently and hard. You'd follow tactical instructions during game situations, which I understand might go against the harpy preference for individual movement." He paused. "In exchange, you'd get territory, resources, protection under one of the highest noble houses in the devil hierarchy, a bed that isn't a storm drain, and a role designed specifically around what you can actually do rather than what someone decided you were supposed to be." She looked at her rice ball. She looked at the fire escape. She looked back at him. "I want to meet the peerage president before I decide," she said. "That's completely reasonable. I can arrange that today if you're willing. And I want my own room. Also reasonable. And," she said, with a sharpness that told him this was the real condition, the one she had been building toward, "I want to be treated like I'm there because I'm good at something. Not as a charity case." "Zeph," Issei said, with complete honesty, You are the only being I have met who can do what I need done in the northern engagement zone. You're not a charity case. You're the piece I've been looking for. She finished the rice ball in 2 bites, stood, and said, "Lead the way, then." He stood and walked, and she fell into step beside him with the rolling, slightly unsteady gait of someone whose body was built for air rather than pavement, and on the board in his mind a new piece settled into a position he had been holding open for 3 weeks. Chapter 4: What the Queen Carries. Akino Himejima found him on the roof of the main building at 7 in the morning on a Wednesday, which was, as far as she could determine, approximately 3 hours after he had gone to sleep and considerably before any sane person would have elected to be conscious. He was sitting cross-legged with the rating game rulebook open on his lap and a notebook beside him that appeared to have been written in a private shorthand she could not immediately decode. His eyes moved across the pages with the focused economy of someone who was not reading so much as extracting. "You don't sleep much," she observed, setting a thermos of tea down beside him. "I sleep efficiently," he said, without looking up. 4 hours at 90% quality is better than 8 hours at 50%. I don't tend toward the kind of sleep that produces quality rest anyway. My mind keeps working. Akino sat beside him, arranging herself with the graceful precision that was her characteristic way of occupying space. She had changed from her school uniform into something simpler, dark leggings and a loose top, and without the careful social performance of the school days she looked younger, and, she suspected, more accurately herself. She watched him read for a moment before saying, "You have been cataloging everyone. I've noticed. Is it uncomfortable?" "No. It's interesting. Most people watch me and see something to perform in front of. You watch me and appear to be solving a puzzle." He finally looked up. His eyes were dark and direct and entirely lacking the particular quality of attention she usually received from boys, which was a quality she had privately categorized as noise. His attention was the other kind. The kind that was actually paying attention. "I've been working on the queen position," he said. In rating game history, queens are almost universally used as primary combat anchors. High power, wide range, first to engage. In every recorded high-level game, both sides build their strategy around their queen's position. That's standard doctrine, Akino said. It's also exploitable by anyone who understands standard doctrine. If your opponent knows your queen will anchor the center, they can build their entire strategy around neutralizing the center first. He turned the notebook toward her. The shorthand, seen at this angle, appeared to be a combination of chess notation and something she could not immediately identify. "I've been modeling a different deployment. Your position is not the anchor. Your position is the trap." Akino looked at the notebook. She looked at him. "The trap," she repeated. "Your lightning techniques have a range of approximately 150 meters at full power, and considerably more if you use the indirect channels through atmospheric ionization. No opponent can get close to you when you're operational." He tapped the notebook. "Which means every opponent we face will try to neutralize you first. Before the game board is fully set. They'll commit significant resources to it. If we let them believe they've done so successfully, and then you're somewhere else entirely, the resources they committed to your neutralization have been wasted while we've already achieved position on 3 other vectors." A long pause. "You want me to appear vulnerable," Akino said slowly. "I want your opponents to believe they've removed you from the equation," he corrected. "The actual you will be in position to deliver the finishing sequence while their best pieces are celebrating having dealt with the decoy." Akino was quiet, looking at the notebook. The morning light was moving in from the east, touching the rooftops slowly, and she became aware that she was smiling in a way she did not entirely intend. "That requires a decoy they'll find convincing," she said. "I've been working on that aspect. Kaneko has a new application for her senjutsu that can mimic energy signatures with some development. It's not a perfect replica, but it doesn't need to be. It needs to be convincing for approximately 12 minutes. You've already talked to Kaneko about this. She's interested." She didn't say so in exactly those words, but she stopped walking away while I was explaining it, which I've found is her version of enthusiastic agreement. Akino laughed. It was the kind of laugh that surprised her, coming from somewhere more genuine than her social tools could reach. "Issei," she said, when the laugh subsided. Can I ask you something that is not about rating games? You can ask me anything. When you catalogued everyone in the peerage, what did you see when you looked at me? Not the Queen. Me. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was actually considering the question rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. Someone who has learned to be exactly what every situation needs her to be, he said at last, and who is very tired of it. Someone who uses warmth and charm as armor rather than because they feel safe without it. Someone who is considerably more serious than she lets people see, because seriousness might be mistaken for something heavier that she'd prefer to keep private. A pause. Someone who is, when she allows herself to be, one of the most precise thinkers in any room she occupies. Akina looked at him for a long moment. That is, she said quietly, the most accurate description of me that anyone has offered in some time. I could be wrong about parts of it. You're not, she said. That is the slightly unsettling part. She picked up the thermos and poured tea into the small cup that had come with it, and handed it to him because he had been awake for approximately 21 hours and someone should do something about that, and for a few minutes they sat in the early morning light without talking, which was something Aquino had not done with anyone in a considerable time and which felt, to her great surprise, like something close to simple peace. Chapter 5. The Kirin in the Abandoned Temple. The information came from Zephyrin, who had taken to the role of scout with an enthusiasm that Issei suspected was at least partially gratitude expressed through productivity. She found him in the club room at 4 in the afternoon with a hand-drawn map and a rapid, slightly breathless account of having seen something in the old Shinto shrine 3 kilometers north of Koa's academic district. Something that moved like liquid and left frost on the ground it walked across and had a single spiraling horn that caught the light like carved ice. Issei looked at the map. He looked at Zephyrin's drawing of the horn. Kirin, he said. Zeph blinked. You knew what it was immediately. I've been researching forgotten and declassified supernatural species for the past 3 weeks. Kirin appear in multiple mythological systems under different names, but the characteristics are consistent. Hooves, the horn, the frost signature, and a nature alignment that makes them extraordinarily sensitive to the intentions of those around them. He was already pulling his coat on. They're categorized as neutral, which in supernatural politics means they've been ignored. The last registered Kirin in Japanese territory was documented 40 years ago. What does a Kirin do in a rating game context? Potentially nothing. They're not fighters by nature. He moved toward the door. But I'm not looking for another fighter. I'm looking for something different. The shrine was old enough to have accumulated the particular atmospheric weight of a place that has been considered sacred by many generations of people. The stone lanterns along the approach path were thick with moss. The torii gate at the entrance had weathered to a gray that suggested it predated the current century. The air inside the approach smelled of pine and something colder and older. Issei walked slowly and kept his hands visible. He had read enough about Kirin to understand that appearing non-threatening was not a performance here. Kirin were described in reliable sources as capable of reading intent at a distance. He found her in the main shrine courtyard, standing near the ablution fountain with her forelegs in the water, and her head turned toward him with an alertness that was not quite alarm. She was smaller than he had expected, perhaps 14 hands at the shoulder, with a coat the color of winter clouds and the frost signature on the stone around her hooves that Zephyrin had described. The horn caught the afternoon light and scattered it in patterns that had no logical source. She watched him approach for a long moment. Then she spoke, in a voice that was nothing like anything he had prepared for, clear and precise, and carrying the weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. You are cataloging me, she said. I am, he said honestly. Most beings who find me run, she said. Or attempt to capture. You are doing neither. Running seems inefficient. Capture seems counterproductive. He stopped at a respectful distance, and crouched down to be lower than her eyeline, which every source he had read indicated was the appropriate posture for a first meeting with Kirin. I'm here because I've been looking for someone who can do something specific, and I think you might be able to do it. What specific thing? Information gathering in spaces where magical signatures are monitored. You read intent, which means you can identify deception and hidden purpose in conversations that our opponents might be having in settings where surveillance is expected. You can also move in ways that disrupt tracking enchantments because your own magical signature is classified as natural phenomenon rather than supernatural presence. He paused. In a strategic context, perfect information is more valuable than most combat abilities. I've been building a team around capabilities, and the information layer is the one I haven't been able to fill. The Kirin was quiet for a long time. The water from the ablution fountain continued its soft sound. You are a very young devil, she said finally. 3 weeks, he agreed. And you have already assessed my capabilities from sources that have not correctly described Kirin in at least 2 centuries. I worked with incomplete information and triangulated. If I've gotten anything wrong, I'd genuinely like to know. Accurate data is more useful to me than a picture I've constructed to fit my expectations. She moved. It was not quite walking. It was the motion of something that exists in a slightly different relationship with gravity than most things, fluid and unhurried and beautiful in a way that was entirely unself-conscious. She circled him slowly, and he remained still and let her complete the assessment. Your intent is what you have described, she said, coming to a stop in front of him. Strategic application. No deception. Some uncertainty about whether your approach is correct, which is a healthy thing. A pause. There is also something else. What else? You are angry, she said. Not at me. At a system. The structure of how supernatural beings are ranked and used and discarded. It is very old anger, patient and controlled, but it is there. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I find the way the supernatural world treats beings like you, like the harpy who brought me here, like several other species I've been reading about, systematically unjust. I don't think the rating game as currently practiced reflects the actual capabilities of the beings involved. I intend to demonstrate that, which requires building a team that proves the point. The Kirin looked at him for a very long time. My name is Hyuka, she said. And I will come and speak with your peerage president. That's all I'm asking. It is not all you are hoping for, she said, with something in her voice that might have been amusement. But it is a beginning. Act 2. Opening Gambits. Chapter 6. The Full Board. 6 weeks after his death and reincarnation, Issei called the first full strategic briefing. The club room had been rearranged. The long table now held a topographic model of the standard rating game arena type, built by Issei from materials that Rias had provided without comment, and a precision that had made Kiba quietly revise several of his previous assumptions about their new member. Color-coded markers stood at positions across the model. A whiteboard on the eastern wall held what appeared to be a decision tree of considerable complexity. 7 people gathered around the table: Rias, Akino, Kiba, Kaneko, Asia, who had been formally invited and sat with the attentive seriousness of someone doing their best to absorb everything useful, Zephyrine, who stood slightly away from the table with her wings folded close and her eyes moving between the model and the decision tree with an expression of focused interest, and Hyuka, who had, to Issei's privately expressed relief, agreed to a trial association with the peerage following. 3 conversations with Rias that Issei had not been present for, and about which Rias had told him only that they had been illuminating. Issei stood at the head of the table. I want to begin, he said, with something I've been thinking about since the night I joined this peerage. The fundamental philosophy of rating game strategy, as practiced by the large majority of competing peerages, is built around a simple premise: deploy your strongest piece first and trust that superior power wins. He looked around the table. That premise is wrong. Rias raised an eyebrow. Akino smiled. Kaneko ate a piece of steamed bun and said nothing. Kiba leaned forward slightly. Superior power wins if power is the only variable, Issei continued. But rating games have multiple variables simultaneously in play: terrain, information, timing, energy management, opponent psychology, and coordination. A team with 60% of another team's raw power that manages all other variables correctly will defeat the more powerful team reliably. I've modeled this across historical game records, and the correlation holds. He moved to the whiteboard. Our team does not have inferior power. Rias Bucho's power of destruction makes her individually competitive with devil-class opponents in any pure confrontation. Akino's lightning range and precision is matched by almost nothing in documented peerage history. Kiba's speed is in the top 5% of swords users recorded in the past century. He paused. But we have been losing or drawing games we should win, because our superior power has been deployed without the coordination that multiplies it. He turned back to the table. Here is what I want to build. The Gremry Peerage as a weapons system. Not as a collection of strong individuals, but as a single strategic entity with 5 hands and 1 mind directing them. Silence. Then Kaneko said, 1 mind being yours. In game situations, yes? Outside game situations, everyone thinks for themselves and I'm just the person who reads too many books. He looked at her steadily. Does that create a problem? A long pause. Kaneko finished the steamed bun and appeared to be considering the question with genuine seriousness. Not if the plans are good, she said. I'll do my best to make them good. He turned to the model. Let me walk you through how I've been thinking about our next engagement. What followed was 2 hours that everyone present would later describe, in their own way, as the moment the Gremry Peerage became something different. Issei walked them through the model with the patience of someone who had organized this picture many times in his own head and understood that translating it to 7 other people required a different kind of care than having it himself. He explained each position and its relationship to the others. He described the decision trees, the if this then that branches that the model generated for the most probable opponent moves. He showed how each member's capabilities fit into a larger sequence. He watched their faces as they understood. Kiba's expression shifted from cautious attention to something that looked, briefly, like relief. He had been a gifted swordsman without a context for his gift. Seeing it placed in a structure that gave it a defined function and a clear relationship to the rest seemed to settle something in him. Akino's smile changed quality. It became less a performance and more a genuine response, the smile of someone who has been given a complex problem and found it interesting. Zephyrin stood straighter as Issei described the northern engagement zone role he had designed for her, the pressure column positioning that would convert ranged attacks from opponents into wasted energy, while she maintained high ground and visibility. She had been told many times in her life what she was not. Being told specifically and precisely what she was in this context had a visible effect. Hyuka watched everything with the still attention of something that reads intent, and once, when Issei was explaining the intelligence-gathering layer, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite approving and not quite something else but was somewhere between the two. Ria sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing. When it was finished, when Issei had covered the last decision branch and answered the last round of questions, she looked at the table with the expression he had come to catalogue as her genuinely surprised face, the one she could not entirely manage into her usual composed presentation. When I found you in the courtyard, she said quietly, I thought I was saving you. The room was very still. You were, Issei said. Mutually exclusive scenarios are relatively rare. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood and addressed the assembled peerage with the formal gravity she used for important declarations. We have a rating game in 5 weeks. Our opponent is the Phoenix Peerage. Their ranking is significantly higher than ours. The conventional assessment of our chances is not favorable. She looked around the table. I believe we should stop paying attention to the conventional assessment. Chapter 7. The Anatomy of a Phoenix. Riser Phoenix was, by almost any available metric, an exceptional rating game player. Issei spent 12 days researching him. The picture that assembled itself across those 12 days was detailed and, to him, deeply interesting. Not because Riser was an unusual opponent, but because he was a textbook one. Every strategic decision he had made in 11 recorded games followed a pattern that was as legible, once you knew the language, as a sequence of chess openings. He favored overwhelming force in the first 10 minutes, he used his regeneration to absorb punishment that would debilitate conventional opponents, he deployed his bishop twins for area denial and his queen for direct confrontation, and he had won 9 of his 11 games by forcing opponents into a reactive position from which they could not recover. He was, in short, a player who had never once been surprised. Issei considered this for a long time, turning it over in his mind the way a craftsman turns over a piece of wood to find the grain. Then he called Hyuka. I need information about the Phoenix household's internal dynamics, he said. They were sitting in the shrine courtyard, which Hyuka had retained as a private space even after formalizing her association with the peerage. She moved through the Gremry residence like water, present when needed and absent when preferred, and Issei had respected this boundary with the consistency that had, he suspected, contributed to her willingness to trust him. Specifically, Hyuka said, I want to know about the relationship between Riser and his peerage. The emotional current, not the formal structure. Specifically whether his queen and his bishops function as genuinely loyal partners or as instruments who follow from obligation. Hyuka was quiet for a moment, looking at the water in the ablution fountain. You believe there is a strategic difference, a significant one. A peerage where the members are genuinely committed to each other's safety will make different decisions under pressure than a peerage where the members are performing loyalty. Genuine commitment creates predictable protection behaviors. Players will deviate from optimal tactical positions to prevent harm to allies they actually care about. He paused. If Riser's pieces perform for him rather than alongside him, they won't take those protective deviations. That creates exploitable gaps in his defensive formation. Hyuka looked at him for a long moment. You are going to use their loyalty, or lack thereof, as a weapon, she said. I'm going to understand it accurately and account for it in the plan. Whether it becomes a weapon depends on what the information shows. She considered this for a while. I can attend a neutral supernatural gathering where members of the Phoenix household are expected to be present, she said. Kirin are not associated with either peerage and will not be recognized as affiliated. I can observe and report. That's all I need. It is not, she said, with the gentle precision she used when correcting him, all you need. You also need someone on the ground near the venue whose observable presence gives me cover. A Kirin arriving at a social gathering alone is conspicuous. A Kirin arriving as a companion to a young devil who has a valid social reason to attend is considerably less so. Issei considered this. Who would have a valid social reason to attend? The social gathering in question, Hyuka said, with a quality in her voice that he had begun to identify as her version of amusement, is a young devil social event where peerages sometimes send representatives. You are a member of the Gremry peerage. Your president is directly engaged to the gentleman we are investigating. Issei went very still. I was aware of the engagement situation, he said carefully. I did not realize there was an associated social event. There are many things that happen in social structures that do not appear in strategic databases, Hyuka observed. This is one reason a strategist benefits from having someone whose capabilities include social intelligence. Point taken. He straightened. I'll attend. Can you navigate the interaction without triggering the intent reading in someone like Riser, who will presumably have supernatural sensitivity of his own? Riser Phoenix, Hyuka said, is a being who is confident that the world functions as he expects it to. Beings of this type tend to be poor at reading intent because they are not looking for surprises. They are looking for confirmation. A pause. He will see what he expects to see, which is a young, recently reincarnated devil of no particular standing, attending a gathering he has no business attending, wearing an expression that suggests he is slightly out of his depth. Issei thought about this. That's not wrong, he said. No, Hyuka agreed. It is not. Which is precisely why it will serve as excellent cover. Chapter 8. The Social Board. The gathering was held in a devil noble's residence in the eastern quarter of Koa's supernatural district, in rooms that had been designed to impress and succeeded comprehensively. Issei arrived in the suit he owned, which was acceptable, accompanied by Hyuka in a form she described as her social projection, which was the appearance of a composed young woman with silver-white hair and eyes the precise color of winter sky. The horn was present but subtle, easy to overlook if you were not specifically looking for it. Rias had chosen not to attend. She had, she explained, a prior obligation that she did not elaborate on, and her expression when she said it had the careful blankness of someone making a choice they found uncomfortable. Issei had noted this without pressing it. There were dynamics in the Gremry household that he did not yet have complete information about, and the first principle of working with incomplete information was not to make assumptions that exceeded what you actually knew. He had, however, spent 20 minutes before leaving reviewing everything he knew about Riser Phoenix and reminding himself that the purpose of this evening was observation and not confrontation. The reminder proved insufficient. He saw Riser within 11 minutes of arriving, holding court near the refreshment table with the easy confidence of someone who has never walked into a room and doubted his right to occupy it. He was taller than Issei and aesthetically composed in the way of people who have had centuries to develop a personal presentation. He moved through the gathering's social geometry as though the geometry were arranged for his benefit. This was not what caused Issei's carefully maintained observation posture to develop a small crack. What caused the crack was seeing, on the far side of the room, 3 members of Riser's peerage who were standing close together in the way of people who would prefer to be somewhere else, and are making the best of it. He recognized them from his research, the Bishop twins, Mira and Ravel. Mira, the elder, was watching the room with an expression that was professional and slightly exhausted. Ravel, the younger, was watching Riser with an expression that was more complicated. It was the expression of someone who has been told a story about a person for a very long time, and is beginning to wonder if the story is entirely true. Ravel Phoenix was, Issei's research suggested, 14 years old and the most technically skilled fire manipulation practitioner in her generation. She was also, as far as he could determine, entirely isolated within a household that treated her capabilities as tools rather than as the expressions of a person with independent existence. He filed this under, relevant but not tonight's priority. He turned back to his observation of Riser's conversational patterns and was doing an adequate job of maintaining detachment until Riser, scanning the room with the easy sweep of someone cataloging who was present and assessing their relevance, made eye contact with him. Riser looked at him for approximately 3 seconds with the expression of someone identifying an unfamiliar piece on a board they thought they knew and deciding whether it warranted attention. Then he smiled, and the smile was the kind that is designed to communicate a hierarchy rather than a feeling. The Gremry peerage sent a representative, he said, to no one in particular, with the volume of someone who intends to be overheard. How considerate. Issei met his eyes and said nothing. I don't believe we've met, Riser said, moving toward him with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never once approached another person and not had them respond the way he expected. The new piece. The sacred gear user. Issei Hayadu, Issei said. I'm the peerage strategist. A fractional pause. Strategist. Is that an unfamiliar term? The smile did not flicker, but something behind Riser's eyes recalculated. Issei noted this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had identified the shape of a thing he had only previously known from descriptions. The Gremry girl has always been a sentimental player, Riser said. Collecting strays. Assigning them roles that sound important. I'm familiar with the assessment. I think it's incomplete. Do you? The strays, as you describe them, have capabilities that your peerage cannot match in specific domains, Issei said, with the calm directness that he had found, over 6 weeks of dealing with supernatural beings, was considerably more effective than either aggression or deference. Wind pressure column construction. Long-range intent detection in monitored environments. Field coordination via distributed sensory input. He paused. I have no interest in debating this here. But I would suggest that underestimating what you don't understand is a strategic error that tends to be corrected expensively. Riser stared at him. Then he laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not the social one. The kind that escapes when something is actually surprising. I look forward to the rating game, he said, and the threat in it was dressed very nicely but was still a threat. So do I, Issei said. On the way back from the gathering, Hayuka walked beside him in her social projection and said, that was not strictly necessary. No, Issei agreed. It revealed your existence as a strategic actor, which reduces the advantage of surprise. Yes. You did it anyway. A pause. He was dismissive of the people I've been recruiting, Issei said. I understand the tactical error. I made it anyway. I'll factor it into the updated plan. Hayuka was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the quality that was her version of warmth, for what it is worth. The younger Phoenix daughter watched you for the entirety of your conversation with her brother. The expression she wore when you said that underestimating what you do not understand is a strategic error that tends to be corrected expensively was the expression of someone hearing a thing they have believed for a long time and never heard said aloud. Issei filed this under, incomplete picture, requires more data. He walked back to the Gremry residence in the cool autumn night and updated his plan. Chapter 9, 5 Weeks of Becoming. Training began the next morning. Not the training the peerage had done before, which had been individual practice conducted in parallel, each member working on their own capabilities in their own way with no particular relationship to what anyone else was doing. This was something different. Issei called it coordination drilling, which was not a term that existed in supernatural training literature, because nothing like it had previously been attempted. The principle was simple. In a raiding game, the outcome of any individual engagement depends not only on the participants, but on everything happening simultaneously elsewhere on the board. A queen who wins her engagement brilliantly but takes 4 minutes to do so when the plan required 2 minutes creates a cascade of position failures that can unravel an otherwise winning sequence. A knight who delays committing creates an ambiguity in the opposing player's read that can briefly advantage or disadvantage 3 other positions simultaneously. Issei needed to understand, precisely, how long every action took. And then he needed everyone to understand how their timing connected to everyone else's. This is, Kiba said, on the 3rd day of timing drills, sitting on the training ground with his sword across his knees and an expression that mixed genuine engagement with a sort of bemused exhaustion. Not how I expected to spend my afternoons. How did you expect to spend them? Training. Individual combat refinement. Speed development. Those are all in the schedule. Wednesday mornings are individual refinement days. Issei sat beside him with the notebook. What we're doing now is the part that makes Wednesday mornings worth having done. Kiba looked at him. In the weeks since Issei had joined the peerage, Kiba had moved through several clearly distinct phases of relationship with him, initial wariness, then guarded interest. Then a period of active engagement that had culminated in a long conversation in the training ground after midnight about the relationship between technical sword skill and strategic context that had lasted until nearly 4 in the morning and from which both of them had emerged slightly incoherent and considerably more synchronized in how they thought about the game. Can I ask you something? Kiba said. You don't generally need permission. When you designed my role in the plan, the flanking sequence in Sector 3, the timing requires me to not engage the opponent's rook directly even when engagement would be possible. Correct. My instinct in that situation will be to engage. The rook will be within range and a direct attack would be tactically sound by conventional assessment. Also correct. You're asking me to override my instinct. Issei turned to face him. I'm asking you to trust that what looks tactically sound in isolation is strategically counterproductive, in context. If you engage the rook in Sector 3, you delay your position in Sector 5 by approximately 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, the sequence I've designed requires your presence in Sector 5. Without you there at the right moment, Akino's decoy play fails, which means the final sequence collapses before it delivers the result we need. Kiba was quiet, turning this over. The plan works because all of it works together, Issei said. Any individual piece can be tactically sound. The question is whether it's strategically sound. Sometimes those are the same. When they're not, I need you to choose strategy. And you're confident the plan is good enough to justify that choice. I'm confident that the plan is the best I can build with the information I currently have, and that it will develop as the game progresses because real games never follow the plan exactly. A pause. I'm not asking you to follow a script. I'm asking you to understand the architecture well enough to improvise within it. Kiba looked at him for a long moment. That, he said, is a different thing entirely. Yes. I can work with that. Kaneko came to him on a Tuesday evening with a question he had been waiting for. The 15%, she said, standing in the doorway of the club room where he was working. He waited. I hold it back because, she paused, and her voice carried the weight of something said carefully, because my sister. Kuroka. She lost control. Her power expanded beyond what she could manage. And she hurt people. A pause. I am afraid the same thing happens if I stop holding it back. Issei set down the notebook. Thank you for telling me, he said. Does it change the plan? It changes how I understand the variable, which changes how I design around it. He thought for a moment. I'm not going to ask you to release that limiter. That's your decision, and it's made for reasons that make sense. What I want to do is understand precisely how far you can go comfortably, and build the plan to work with that ceiling rather than around a version of you that doesn't exist. She was quiet. You said, she said, when we first talked, that understanding the pattern helps you work with it. Yes. The pattern is fear. The pattern is a safety mechanism developed in response to a real event, he said carefully. Those are not the same thing, even though fear is part of it. One is a response. The other is a description of the response. He met her gaze. Your strength as it is, without the 15%, is already more than most opponents can handle. I'd rather have all of what you're comfortable giving than 3/4 of something you're fighting yourself to produce. Kaneko was quiet for a long time. Then she walked into the room and sat down across from him and said, "Show me the part of the plan where my ceiling matters." He opened the notebook and showed her. Chapter 10, the night before the game. The rating game was scheduled for a Saturday, beginning at noon. On Friday evening, Issei sat at the table alone after everyone had gone to sleep, going over the plan for the last time. He had a habit of reviewing the entire architecture on the night before a significant event, not looking for new things to add but checking the coherence of what already existed. Every decision tree. Every contingency branch. Every position and timing and the connections between them. It was less about finding errors at this point and more about achieving the particular clarity that came from knowing that he had done everything he could do with the information available. The door opened at 11:30. Rias sat down across from him, wearing a loose sweater over pajamas, her hair down, the formal presentation of the peerage president entirely absent. She looked like a person rather than a role, which was an appearance Issei had come to understand she reserved for situations where she chose to. "You should sleep," she said. "You've been at this for hours." "I'm almost finished." "You said that 2 hours ago." He looked up. "You've been checking?" "I looked in when I couldn't sleep." She folded her hands on the table. Her blue eyes in the lamplight were direct and, for a moment, entirely unguarded. "Issei, can I ask you something before tomorrow?" "Of course." "When you designed the plan for this game, what did you actually believe our chances of winning were?" He considered being diplomatic. Then he considered that Rias Gremery was the kind of person to whom the truth was more useful than comfort, and that this quality was one of the reasons he had agreed to work with her. "Initially, with the peerage as it was when I joined, our chances were approximately 40%, he said. "Against Reiser, who has a significantly stronger peerage on conventional metrics, the conventional assessment would be around 25%. And now I believe we will win." He said it without qualification. "Not because I'm optimistic. Because the specific combinations we've built address the specific ways Reiser wins games, and because the pieces we've assembled have capabilities he hasn't encountered and cannot have prepared for." A pause. "He is not a bad player. He is a player who has never been surprised. Tomorrow I intend to surprise him repeatedly until the structural integrity of his game collapses." Rias looked at him for a long moment. "The engagement," she said quietly. "Between me and Reiser. You know about it." "Yes. And you know that winning this game does not technically dissolve it. The engagement was not structured as a rating game prize." "I know." He met her gaze. "I designed the plan to win the game. The other situation is yours to navigate as you see fit. I'm not," he paused carefully, "designing strategy for your personal life. That's not my role." Something shifted in her expression. Something that was almost relief and might have been something else. "No," she said. "It isn't." A pause. "But winning the game will matter. Even if it doesn't end the engagement automatically. It will matter to people who need to see that the Gremery peerage is worth taking seriously. That the path I've chosen in building it is defensible. Then we'll win," Issei said. "And the path will have been defensible." Rias looked at him in the lamplight, at the table covered in its architecture of index cards and notation and 5 weeks of careful work, and she said softly, "I am very glad you counter-proposed from a courtyard." "So am I," he said, and meant it entirely. She stood and straightened and was again, with the seamlessness of long practice, the composed figure of the Gremery heir rather than the person in the sweater. But the two things were not, Issei had decided, as separate as they appeared. They were the same person wearing different tools. "Sleep," she said from the doorway. "The plan is good. Let it rest." He looked at the table for a moment after she left. Then he closed the notebook and went to sleep, and on the board behind his closed eyes, the pieces were all exactly where he had placed them, waiting, patient, ready. Act 3. The Grandmaster Plays. Chapter 11. Game Start. The raiding game arena manifested at noon in a pocket dimension registered to the Devil Judiciary Oversight Committee, a standard configuration that Issei had studied in 3 separate technical documents, and could now navigate from memory. It was a city. Not a specific city, but the abstract concept of a city rendered in physical space, streets and buildings, and the suggestion of interior spaces, approximately 8 square kilometers of urban topology that could be traversed in under 20 minutes by foot and considerably less by flight. The sky above it was a permanent gray-white, neither day nor night, the absent light of a space that had been designed for conflict rather than habitation. Issei stood at the assembly point with the peerage gathered around him and said nothing for a moment, looking at the city. Then he said, "We have been over this enough times that I don't need to repeat the plan. Everyone knows their position and their timing and their contingency responses. What I want to say before we begin is something different." He turned to face them. "I've spent 5 weeks watching each of you. I have spent those weeks believing that the way you've been described by the world around you, as secondary pieces, as supporting roles, as creatures whose value is their utility to more important beings, is wrong. Not strategically wrong. Actually wrong. Every one of you is extraordinary in ways that the standard ranking systems cannot measure, because the standard ranking systems were built by people who only valued one kind of strength." He looked at Zephyrin, who had been told she was a stray for 40 years. He looked at Hyuka, who had been categorized as neutral, which was the supernatural world's word for irrelevant. He looked at Asia, who had been expelled from a church for the crime of kindness. He looked at Kaneko, who carried a 15% of herself in reserve because she was afraid of her own capacity. He looked at Kiba, who had been trained as a weapon and was still learning to be a person. He looked at Akino, who wore warmth as armor because the world had given her reasons to. He looked at Rias, who had chosen every single one of them when the world had told her each choice was a mistake. "Today," he said, "we show what this actually is." The silence that followed was the particular silence of 7 people who have understood something at the same moment. Then Kaneko said, "Let's go." Riser Phoenix opened with a standard aggressive formation, because Riser Phoenix always opened with a standard aggressive formation, because it had worked 11 times and he had never been given a reason to vary it. His rooks moved immediately to control the primary intersection points of the Western District. His bishops established area denial in the central plaza. His queen, Eubelina, advanced to the elevated position on the main thoroughfare that offered maximum engagement range. His pawns spread to create a net that would compress the opposing peerage into a zone where Riser's power advantage made engagement decisive. It was, Issei had noted in his research, a beautiful formation. Efficient, aggressive, and built on a premise that had never failed him. The premise being that the Gremmery peerage would respond to it. They did not respond to it. They were already gone. Riser stood at the center of his advancing formation and watched his information feeds show him an empty Western District and an empty central approach and a Gremmery peerage that had, by all evidence, simply failed to appear in the conventional engagement zones. His queen sent a communication, initial sweep complete, no contact. His rook pair reported the same. His bishop twins reported the same. Riser Phoenix stood in the center of his perfect formation and, for the first time in 11 raiding games, felt something that took him a moment to identify because it was unfamiliar. He felt uncertain. They were in the Eastern District. Issei had chosen the Eastern District 3 weeks ago, based on a topographic analysis of the standard city configuration that revealed a counterintuitive fact. The Eastern District, conventionally dismissed as a secondary zone, offered a series of elevated positions and narrow approach corridors that functionally negated Riser's numerical advantage in direct confrontation. In the Eastern District, 5 pieces moving in coordination could hold a defensive formation against 8 pieces moving without coordination, because the terrain compressed engagement range and reduced the value of superior numbers. They had 2 objectives in the first phase. Not to engage. Not to win. To wait, and to watch, and to let Riser's formation exhaust itself searching a city for a peerage that wasn't where expected. "Clock," Issei said quietly, touching the communication device at his ear. Hyoka's voice, calm and precise. 11 minutes since game start. Phoenix Eastern search sweep begins in approximately 4 minutes based on observed formation speed. Zephyrine voice from somewhere above, 2 pawns approaching from the north alley. I can redirect them south with a pressure column in the next 30 seconds without engaging. Do it. A pause. Then done. They're moving south. Issei allowed himself one moment of satisfaction at the fact that the pressure columns were working exactly as he had modeled them. Then he turned his attention to the next phase. Kiba. Position check. Sector 7, elevated. I have visual on the rook pair. Do not engage. Watch their communication patterns and tell me when they shift to a joint sweep. Understood. He turned to Rias, who stood beside him in the shadow of a building with her power held carefully contained, a deliberate concealment they had practiced for 2 weeks. Phase 2 begins when Ybelina is separated from the central formation, he said quietly. I estimate 12 more minutes. You've been accurate so far, Rias said. I'll be accurate on that one too. He looked at her. You know your part. I know my part, she said, and her eyes were steady and calm and entirely certain in a way that told him she was, in this moment, exactly where she wanted to be. Chapter 12, The Middle Game. Ybelina separated from the central formation at the 14-minute mark, 2 minutes past Issei's estimate, which he filed under acceptable variance and adjusted downstream timing accordingly. She moved to the elevated position on the northern approach, where her range would cover the broadest possible search zone. She moved with the confidence of someone who is accustomed to being the strongest piece on the board. She was not careless. She maintained a defensive posture and kept her magical output masked. She was, objectively, doing everything correctly. She was doing it in the one position on the board that Issei had needed her in. Aquino, he said. Ready. Wait for my count. 3, 2, 1. Ybelina's position exploded in a cascade of purple lightning and Aquino's laughter from somewhere in the northern sky. The Queen of the Phoenix Peerage was not harmed, because she was as powerful as her reputation and her defensive abilities were genuinely exceptional, but the engagement occupied her entirely, her attention locked into the direct confrontation with a lightning technique of equivalent scale to her own, the calculation of who was stronger making all other considerations irrelevant. And Aquino was not in the northern sky. The lightning was a distillation construct, a shaped magical output that could sustain itself for approximately 7 minutes without direct control. Aquino herself was in Sector 9, in the Eastern District, in a position from which she had line of sight to the central formation's rear. Kaneko, Issei said. A pause of approximately 2 seconds. Then, their communication array went down. He had spent 4 sessions with Kaneko developing the Senjutsu application for disrupting supernatural communication, which was, as he had suspected, well within the scope of what she could manage comfortably below the 15% threshold. It was delicate work, more nuanced than her combat applications, and she had approached it with the precise, careful attention she gave everything she was actually interested in. For the next 6 minutes, Riser's pieces could not communicate with each other except by direct proximity. Kiba, Issei said. Now. Kiba moved through Sector 5 with the speed that Issei had timed at 37 meters per second at full extension, which was a measurement that had seemed academic until the moment it was necessary. He passed the rook pair without engaging. He moved through the gap in the western net that Zephyrine had created by redirecting 2 pawns 2 minutes ago. He reached the position in the central district that the plan required in 2 minutes and 43 seconds. He arrived 17 seconds ahead of the minimum required timing. He would have been there faster, but he had deliberately not taken the route that would have allowed him to engage a Phoenix pawn en route, because the plan did not require that engagement, and the 17-second advantage was worth more than the elimination of 1 pawn. He had chosen strategy over instinct. He held position, breathing steadily, waiting for the sequence to unfold. Riser identified that something was wrong at the 19-minute mark. The signal was subtle. His bishops reported anomalous energy readings in the Eastern District that did not match the Gremry Peerage's known signatures. His communication array had gone down, which he had initially attributed to interference from the game's terrain rather than an intentional disruption. His queen had been engaged by what appeared to be a very powerful lightning construct, and the construct had persisted for longer than a controlled magical output should have been able to without a user maintaining it. He was, for the first time in 11 games, reading a situation that he could not immediately categorize. He moved toward the Eastern District himself, because he was Riser Phoenix, and the answer to a confusing situation was always to apply more power directly. This was, Issei had noted in his research, Riser's core strategic habit. The habit that made him extraordinary against conventional opponents, and the habit that a sufficiently non-conventional plan would make into a liability. Riser, moving toward the Eastern District, was leaving his formation center without its anchor. He's moving, Hyuka's voice said. Direction and speed. Eastern approach. Rapid movement. Alone. Issei allowed himself to exhale. Asia, he said. Asia Argento's voice was calm in a way that surprised him every time he heard it in a tactical context, given how gentle she was in every other context. Ready. Kaneko needs support in 2 minutes. Mark the position. Marked. He turned to Rias. She was already looking at him with the expression that he had come to understand meant she saw exactly what he was doing and was ready to execute her part of it. This is it? She said. This is it. His formation has no center, no communication, and no queen. All 3 of his engagement layers are either neutralized, redirected, or occupied. The open path runs from Sector 4 through the Central District to his designated command position, and if I take the command position, the game ends. He's the only piece left with the ranking to protect it. He paused. He will try to stop you personally. When he does, you'll face him directly. You're stronger than he is in a straight confrontation. You've always been stronger than him in a straight confrontation. The reason you've been losing games isn't power. It's position. And now we have position. Now we have position. Rias looked at the path that led through the silent city toward the command position. Her crimson hair moved in a wind that had no source. The power of destruction, held in patient containment for 23 minutes, was ready. Stay back, she told him. Not an order. A concern. I'm not a combat piece, he agreed. I'll be exactly where I need to be. She held his gaze for one moment, and in that moment she was not performing anything for anyone. She was entirely herself, standing at the threshold of something she had been building toward for years. You built something extraordinary, she said quietly. We built it, he said. I just read the board. She moved. Chapter 13 Endgame. Riser Phoenix was the strongest piece on the board. This fact was not in dispute. His regeneration made direct damage temporary. His fire manipulation covered a scale and intensity that could turn the game's urban terrain into a weapon. He had won 9 games by being exactly this, the overwhelming presence that no amount of clever maneuvering could ultimately defeat. He found Rias in the Central District at the 28-minute mark. She was standing in the middle of the main intersection, alone, her crimson hair loose around her shoulders and her power visible around her hands, the dark crackling annihilation energy of her bloodline made manifest. She was not hiding. She was not running. She was standing in the middle of the main intersection waiting for him. He had expected to feel satisfaction at this. The final engagement, the direct confrontation that his strength would resolve, the moment where clever positioning became irrelevant in the face of simple overwhelming power. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt, with a clarity that was entirely unwelcome, that this was exactly where someone had needed him to be. He was right. He was right, and he engaged anyway, because he was Riser Phoenix and he had never backed down from a confrontation in his life, and because the alternative was to turn away from Rias Gremry standing calmly in the intersection with her power gathered and her eyes steady, and something in him refused to do that. The exchange was catastrophic in both directions. His fire and her annihilation energy met, and the resulting interaction was not an absorption or a cancellation but a collision that sent both of them backward. He regenerated, as he always did, but the regeneration took time, and during the time it was taking, something else was happening. Eubelina had disengaged from the lightning construct 7 minutes ago. She had been moving toward the Central District with the methodical precision of a queen who understands that the final engagement is where games are decided. She had identified Rias's position and was approaching from the north. She did not arrive. Aquino arrived first. The real Aquino, not the construct, from the position in Sector 9 where she had been waiting for exactly this sequence, with 12 minutes of accumulated energy from the atmospheric ionization that the game terrain's permanent electrical current provided, energy she had been gathering since the game began because Issei had noted, 3 weeks ago, that the standard arena configuration produced an ionization gradient that a sufficiently sensitive user could draw from. Ubeluna, who was the best prepared and most capable queen in the current generation of rating game players, had not expected this, because no one had ever done it before. The Queen of the Phoenix peerage yielded at the 31-minute mark. Riser was on his feet, regenerated, when he understood what had happened. His formation had not failed. His formation had been made irrelevant. He was alone in the central district, his queen yielded, his bishops unable to communicate their positions, his rooks redirected to the wrong district by a pressure column technique he had no file on, his pawns scattered across a search pattern that had found nothing because the peerage they were searching for had never been in the expected location. He had spent 31 minutes fighting an empty board, and now the command position on his side of the game was occupied by Rias Gremery, who was standing at his designated anchor point with the game's spatial markers closing around her in the pattern that indicated territorial control. This, he said to no one, or perhaps to the architect of this situation who he was fairly certain was somewhere out of direct engagement range, is not how this game was supposed to go. No, said Rias Gremery from the command position, her voice carrying perfectly through the quiet city. It was not how you expected it to go. Those are different things. Riser Phoenix, in his 12th rating game, did something he had never done in 11 prior games. He considered retreating. He did not retreat. He was who he was. He engaged, and the engagement was brutal and prolonged and concluded at the 47-minute mark when his regeneration, subjected to the power of destruction's continuous targeted application by a Rias Gremery who had been in perfect positional advantage for 16 minutes, finally could not keep pace. He yielded. The arena dissolved. In the dimensional space between the game's artificial geography and the real world, the peerage assembled at the extraction point, and for a moment no one said anything. Then Zephyrine made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cry of something that had no clean name, and Kiba's composed expression abandoned him entirely, and Asia pressed both hands over her mouth with tears on her face that were clearly not distress, and Kaneko looked at the floor for a moment with an expression that was, very quietly, the expression of someone who has proven something to themselves. Akino put her hands on Issei's shoulders and said, "You absolute ridiculous person." "The plan worked," he said. "The plan was," she said, "absolutely insane and completely correct, and I will never forgive you for making me understand exactly when and where to be for 17 different contingency situations. You remembered all of them." "Of course I remembered all of them. I remember everything." "That is not the point." He was smiling, which was not something he did with great frequency, and he was aware of it, and did not attempt to stop it. Rias Gremery stepped through the assembling peerage to stand in front of him, and she looked at him with an expression that he could not precisely catalogue because it was several things at once, none of which had a clean label. "We won," she said. "We won," he agreed. The Phoenix household's observers were watching. The Devil Judiciary observers were watching. Everyone who needed to see that this peerage is worth taking seriously was watching. "Yes." A pause. "Issei." Her voice was quiet, meant for him rather than the assembled peerage. "The way you talked about them this morning. Before the game. It was accurate," he said. "I said what I observed. I know it was accurate." "That's what made it," she paused, searching for the word matter. "Anyone can praise their team before a contest. You described specific people with specific qualities and you said it like it was data rather than encouragement. That is considerably harder to dismiss." He thought about this for a moment. "I've never been good at the performance of feeling things," he said. "I am considerably better at describing what I actually observe. I observed extraordinary people doing extraordinary things for 5 weeks. The description was easy." She looked at him for another long moment. "The engagement between me and Riser," she said. "It is not resolved by this game. You know that." "I know. There will be more pieces of that situation to navigate." "Yes. And the peerage." "Zeph. Hyoka. The work we've only started." "Yes. She looked at the assembled peerage around them, at Seth who was still laughing, at Kiba who was talking to Kaneko with an animation he almost never showed, at Asia explaining something to Hyuka with her characteristic thorough kindness, at Akino watching all of it with the expression of someone who has discovered, to their genuine surprise, that they are happy. The board is large, Ria said. The board is very large, Issei agreed. We've made the first moves. She turned back to him. And in the strange sourceless light of the dimensional space between games, her expression was the unguarded one, the one reserved for situations where she chose to be entirely herself rather than any of the roles she wore so easily. Then we continue, she said. We continue, he agreed. Around them, the peerage prepared to return to the world, and on the board in his mind, the pieces were in motion, and the game was far from over, and somewhere in the architecture of everything that was still to come, he was already thinking 12 moves ahead. Act 2. Opening Gambits. Chapter 6. The Full Board. 6 weeks after his death and reincarnation, Issei called the first full strategic briefing. He had spent the 3 days prior to the meeting doing what he always did before a significant presentation, walking through the material so many times in his own mind that it ceased to feel like material and became simply the shape of the truth. He had arranged and rearranged the index cards on the long table until the architecture they formed matched the architecture in his head with near perfect fidelity. He had prepared for the questions he expected, which required him to model each person in the room well enough to anticipate what each of them would need to understand, because the same explanation does not work for 7 different people, and a strategist who gives the same briefing to everyone is not briefing anyone. He had also, privately, spent a considerable amount of time wondering whether any of this would land the way he intended. The club room had been rearranged. The long table now held a topographic model of the standard rating game arena type, built from materials Rias had provided and a precision that had made Kiba quietly revise several prior assumptions about their newest member. Color-coded markers stood at positions across the model. A whiteboard on the eastern wall held what appeared to be a decision tree of considerable complexity, organized into branches labeled with the shorthand Issei had developed over his first weeks and annotated in red wherever a branch carried what he privately called catastrophic variance, meaning the places where a small error produced a large failure. 7 people gathered around the table: Rias, Akino, Kiba, Kaneko, Asia, who had been formally invited and sat with the attentive seriousness of someone doing their best to absorb everything useful, Zephyrin, who stood slightly away from the table with her wings folded close and her eyes moving between the model and the decision tree with an expression of focused interest that she had not yet learned to conceal, and Hyuka, who had, to Issei's privately expressed relief, agreed to a trial association with the peerage following 3 conversations with Rias that Issei had not been present for, and about which Rias had told him only that they had been illuminating. Issei stood at the head of the table and looked at all of them for a moment before he began. He thought about what each of them had come from. The harpy who had spent 40 years as a stray. The Kirin who had been classified as neutral, which was the supernatural world's word for unimportant. The healer who had been expelled for the crime of being kind to the wrong person. The rook who carried a self-imposed ceiling because she was afraid of her own depth. The knight who had been trained as a weapon and was still assembling himself into a person. The queen who wore warmth as armor because the alternative felt too exposed. The heir to a noble house who had been choosing all of them when the world had told her each choice was a mistake. He thought, I have to get this right. I want to begin, he said, with something I've been thinking about since the night I joined this peerage. The fundamental philosophy of rating game strategy, as practiced by the large majority of competing peerages, is built around a simple premise: deploy your strongest piece first and trust that superior power wins. He let that sit for a moment. That premise is wrong. Rias raised an eyebrow. Akino smiled with the quality that meant she was genuinely interested rather than performing interest. Kaneko ate a piece of steamed bun. Kiba leaned forward slightly with the posture of someone who has been waiting to hear something said out loud that they have been thinking quietly for some time. Superior power wins if power is the only variable, Issei continued. But rating games have multiple variables simultaneously in play: terrain, information, timing, energy management, opponent psychology, and coordination. A team with 60% of another team's raw power that manages all other variables correctly will defeat the more powerful team reliably. I've modeled this across every historical game record available in the club's library, and the correlation holds across 11 decades of documented competition. He moved to the whiteboard. Our team does not have inferior power. Rias Bucho's power of destruction makes her individually competitive with any devil-class opponent in a direct confrontation. Aquino's lightning range and precision is matched by almost nothing in documented peerage history over the past 50 years. Kiba's sword technique and speed place him in the top 5% of swords users in any record I've been able to find. He paused. And our newer members bring capabilities that do not appear in existing defensive doctrine at all, because no one has faced them before. Pressure column wind manipulation. Long-range intent detection in monitored environments. Field coordination via distributed sensory input from positions no opponent will think to account for. He turned back to the table. We have been losing or drawing games we should win because our superior power has been deployed without the coordination that multiplies it. And we have been winning games we should win by more margin than we did, because we have not been playing the full board. We've been playing 5 separate games simultaneously and hoping the individual outcomes add up to a victory. He looked around at all of them. Here is what I want to build. The Gremry Peerage as a weapons system. Not as a collection of strong individuals, but as a single strategic entity with 7 hands and 1 mind directing them. Silence. Then Kaneko said, 1 mind being yours. In game situations, yes? Outside game situations, everyone thinks for themselves and I'm just the person who reads too many books. He looked at her steadily. Does that create a problem? A long pause. Kaneko finished the steamed bun and appeared to be considering the question with genuine seriousness rather than performing deliberation. Not if the plans are good, she said finally. I'll do my best to make them good. He turned to the model. Let me walk you through how I've been thinking about our next engagement. What followed was 2 hours that everyone present would later describe, in their own way, as the moment the Gremry Peerage became something different. Issei walked them through the model with the patience of someone who had organized this picture many times in his own head and understood that translating it to 7 other people required a different kind of care than having it himself. He explained each position and its relationship to the others. He described the decision trees, the if this then that branches that the model generated for the most probable opponent moves. He showed how each member's capabilities fit into a larger sequence, and how the sequence failed if any piece deviated from the timing without a specific reason, and how the sequence could recover from common deviations if everyone understood their contingency roles. He was careful not to present it as a script. He had learned, through direct observation of the peerage over 6 weeks, that the strongest members of any group resist being scripted, not out of ego but out of the entirely legitimate recognition that a script cannot account for everything and that a person locked to a script becomes less effective the moment the situation departs from it. He presented the plan as an architecture rather than a set of instructions. The difference was one of relationship. Instructions make you a function of the plan, while architecture makes the plan a context for your decisions. He watched their faces as they understood. Kiba's expression shifted from cautious attention to something that looked, briefly, like relief. He was a gifted swordsman in search of a context for his gift. Seeing it placed in a structure that gave it a defined function and a clear relationship to the rest seemed to settle something in him that had been quietly unsettled for some time. Aquino's smile changed quality. It became less a performance and more a genuine response, the smile of someone who has been given a complex problem and found it interesting. She asked 3 questions, each one precisely targeted at the part of the plan that relied most heavily on her capabilities, and each question revealed a depth of tactical self-knowledge that Issei had suspected but was gratified to have confirmed. Zephyrin stood straighter as Issei described the northern engagement zone role he had designed for her, the pressure column positioning that would convert ranged attacks from opponents into wasted energy, while she maintained high ground and visibility. She had been told many times in her life what she was not. Being told specifically and precisely what she was in this context, not as charity and not as approximation but as genuine strategic assessment, had a visible effect. Her wings, which she had kept folded close in the body language of someone accustomed to making herself small in unfamiliar rooms, shifted to a more relaxed position. Hyuka watched everything with the still attention of something that reads intent, and once, when Issei was explaining the intelligence-gathering layer and describing how information from her work would flow into the plan's real-time adjustments, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite approving and not quite something else but was somewhere between the two, a look that said, "You have understood what I can do." Which is rarer than you might think. Asia raised her hand at one point and asked, with the earnest precision that characterized her approach to everything, whether there was a protocol for the healing roll when multiple pieces were injured simultaneously, and the triage decision had to be made in under 30 seconds. The question revealed that she had been thinking about this problem independently, which told Issei that she was not simply absorbing the briefing but actively integrating it with her own role-specific thinking, which was exactly what he needed from all of them. Ria sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing for the first hour. She asked 2 questions in the second hour. Both were excellent questions. The first concerned the contingency for a scenario where the initial position strategy failed to draw the opponent's queen away from her anchor, which was the plan's most significant single-point vulnerability. The second concerned the endgame sequence, and the specific conditions under which she should commit her full power rather than continuing to hold the controlled output that the plan's middle phase required. Both questions demonstrated that she had understood not just the surface mechanics of the plan but the underlying logic that generated it, the reason behind each choice rather than just the choice itself. Issei answered both questions. And then, because the questions warranted it, and because the assembled peerage warranted honesty, he said, "These are also the 2 places where I am least confident in the plan. Not because the logic is wrong, but because both are dependent on opponent behavior that I predicted based on observed patterns rather than certainty. If Riser deviates from pattern in either of those 2 moments, we adapt. The contingency branches are on the board in positions labeled R2 and R3. Everyone should know those branches as well as the primary sequence." He looked around the table. "I have spent 5 weeks trying to account for everything. I have not accounted for everything. No plan does. What a good plan does is reduce the number of surprises and give you a structure within which to handle the ones it couldn't eliminate." A pause. Then Zephyrin said, "That's the most honest thing I've heard a strategist say." "I've never been a strategist before," Issei said. "I don't have the habit of overstating confidence yet." Someone laughed. He thought it was Aquino. When it was finished, when Issei had covered the last decision branch and answered the last round of questions, Rias looked at the table with the expression he had come to catalogue as her genuinely surprised face, the one she could not entirely manage into her usual composed presentation. "When I found you in the courtyard," she said quietly, "I thought I was saving you." The room was very still. "You were," Issei said. "Mutually exclusive scenarios are relatively rare." She held his gaze for a moment with an expression he was not entirely sure he knew how to catalogue. Then she stood and addressed the assembled peerage with the formal gravity she used for important declarations. "We have a rating game in 5 weeks. Our opponent is the Phoenix peerage. Their ranking is significantly higher than ours. The conventional assessment of our chances is not favorable." She looked around the table. "I believe we should stop paying attention to the conventional assessment." Chapter 7: The Anatomy of a Phoenix. Riser Phoenix was, by almost any available metric, an exceptional rating game player. Issei spent 12 days researching him. He began with the official game records, which the Devil Judiciary maintained in a registry that Rias had access to through her family credentials. 11 games. 9 wins. 1 loss. 1 draw. The wins were distributed across 3 distinct periods of his playing history, and when Issei arranged them chronologically rather than by outcome, a pattern became visible that the simple win-loss record concealed. Riser had been improving, steadily and without plateau, for the entire period of his documented career. His first 3 wins had been achieved through raw power advantage. His wins in the middle period showed the addition of formation discipline. His most recent wins demonstrated a developing capacity for mid-game adaptation that had not been present 4 years earlier. He was not resting on capability. He was growing. This was the kind of information that changed a risk assessment substantially. Issei noted it, flagged it, and went back to the records. The loss was against the Citri peerage, 3 years ago. He read the summary report 3 times and then spent an afternoon reconstructing the game's sequence from the available fragmentary data, which was a technical exercise in inference that required him to work backward from known outcome positions to probable prior states. The picture that assembled itself was instructive. Riser had won the engagement decisively through the first 20 minutes, and then lost the game in a single 12-minute window during which Sona Citri had executed a coordinated 3-piece combination that had no precedent in any of the prior game sequences. It had been, by any assessment, a surprise. Riser had not been surprised again in the following 8 games. The draw was against an old Lion Devil house whose peerage Issei had fewer records on, but the available summary suggested that the draw had resulted from mutual exhaustion rather than from any deliberate strategic parity. Both sides had committed everything and produced a result that satisfied neither of them. Riser had treated it, as far as Issei could determine from the aftermath documentation, as a loss. He did not tolerate perceived failures well. This was worth knowing. The individual capability assessment took 3 more days. Eubelina, Riser's queen, was the factor that kept returning to the top of every threat calculation. She was not the most powerful queen in recorded game history, but she was consistently the most effectively deployed one. In every game she appeared in, her movement pattern showed an economy and precision that indicated someone who thought about the game the same way Issei did, in terms of positions and sequences rather than individual engagements. She would be the hardest opponent to plan around, because her choices would be the least predictable. He spent 2 full evenings modeling her decision patterns. The Phoenix Rooks were capable and aggressive but operated on simple direct engagement principles. They were the pieces Riser used to establish board control in the opening, and they did it well. Against the standard defensive formation they were devastating. Against a formation that wasn't where they expected it to be, they would spend significant time and energy reorienting. And reorientation time was something Issei intended to exploit. The Bishop twins presented a different kind of problem. Their area denial techniques were potent enough that a direct approach through their coverage zone would be severely costly. He spent considerable time looking at their deployment patterns across multiple games and noticed something that became, over those days of examination, the seed of an idea. They were always deployed together. Same zone, overlapping fields. It was protective strategy, keeping the 2 of them mutually covered, but it also meant that their combined area was a known quantity. If you knew where the area was, you could route around it. And if you could route around it, the energy they had committed to maintaining it was doing nothing. He filed this under exploitable through positioning rather than confrontation. Riser himself he saved for last, because understanding the centerpiece of any formation required understanding everything around it first. What he found, in the end, was a player of genuine quality who had never once been made to doubt that quality. Riser's regeneration was functionally infinite against any sustained assault below a certain threshold, which meant that direct damage was ineffective as a primary strategy. His fire manipulation could convert terrain into a weapon, which meant that standard defensive positioning in open areas was dangerous. His personal combat ability was excellent. His strategic thinking was good and improving. His weakness was not a capability gap. It was an expectation gap. He expected to win. He expected his opponents to respond to his moves. He expected the game to unfold in a particular range of ways because it always had. He was not complacent in the way of lazy players. He was confident in the way of someone who has never been given real evidence to revise his confidence. The plan would need to give him that evidence. Early. Repeatedly. In a way that his formation could not absorb. He called Hyuka on the 8th day of research. They met in the shrine courtyard, which Hyuka had retained as a private space and which Issei had come to understand was a necessary element of her willingness to participate in something as socially complex as a peerage. The outdoor setting, the natural sounds, the absence of enclosed walls, these were not preferences. They were conditions. He had noted this without comment and arranged all of their meetings accordingly. I need information about the Phoenix household's internal dynamics, he said. Specifically, Hyuka said. She always said this. He had come to understand it not as a request for clarification but as a prompt to organize his thinking before speaking, which was a quality he had learned to appreciate. I want to know about the relationship between Riser and his peerage members. Not the formal hierarchy. The emotional current beneath it. Whether his queen and bishops function as genuinely committed partners or as instruments who perform loyalty from obligation rather than choice. Hyuka was quiet for a moment, watching the water in the ablution fountain move in its small constant circle. You believe there is a strategic difference between genuine commitment and performed loyalty. A significant one. A peerage where members are genuinely committed to each other's safety will make different decisions under pressure than one where members are performing. Genuine commitment creates protection behaviors that deviate from optimal tactical positions. Players will abandon a superior strategic position to prevent harm to someone they actually care about. He paused. If Riser's pieces perform for him rather than with him, they won't take those protective deviations. His formation will be strategically correct but emotionally hollow. Against a peerage where the bonds are real, hollow formations develop gaps under pressure that purely tactical analysis doesn't anticipate. Hyuka turned to look at him with the particular quality of attention that meant she was assessing something more than his words. You are asking me to evaluate the quality of love between people I have not met, she said. I'm asking you to read intent, which you can do more accurately than anyone I know. Whether what you find is love or its absence, or something more complicated is the information I need. A long pause. There is a neutral supernatural gathering in 12 days, Hyuka said finally. A social event where members of several peerages, including the Phoenix household, are expected to attend. Kirin are not affiliated with either party, and will not be identified as agents of the Gremry peerage. I can observe and report. That's all I need. It is not, she said, with the gentle precision she used when correcting him, all you need. A Kirin attending a social gathering without a companion is conspicuous in a way that invites questions. The attention those questions generate would compromise the observation. I need a companion who has a legitimate reason to be present. He considered this. The Gremry peerage would have reason to send a representative to a gathering where the Phoenix household is present, he said slowly. Yes. Particularly given the existing formal relationship between the two houses. He thought about the word relationship and what it meant in this context, and the picture that assembled was one he had been aware of for several weeks and had, for reasons he could not entirely justify strategically, been setting aside. The engagement, he said? Yes. Rias Bucho is engaged to Riser Phoenix. She has been since before she began building this peerage, Hyuka said, without inflection. The arrangement was made between the families when she was young. She has been working to demonstrate the value of her peerage partly as a means of establishing grounds to renegotiate the terms. Issei was quiet for a moment. He had known this. He had found the reference in a document in the club room's files weeks ago and had noted it, and continued his research without examining it too closely, which was, he was beginning to understand, itself a kind of decision. I'll attend, he said. Good, Hyuka said. I suggest you find a suit that fits properly. First impressions at social functions of this kind are information that other attendees will use to calibrate their assessment of you, and you are better served by being underestimated than overestimated. I own a suit. I am aware. I have seen it. It fits adequately. A pause that contained what might have been amusement. Adequately is not what we want. Chapter 8, The Social Board. The gathering was held 11 days later in a Devil Noble's residence in the eastern quarter of Koa's supernatural district. The building was old enough to have accumulated a genuine sense of gravity rather than the performed grandeur that newer money tended toward. Its ceilings were high without being ostentatious. Its rooms were proportioned for the scale of the beings who inhabited it rather than for impression. Whoever had built it had understood that power did not need to announce itself. Issei arrived in the suit, which Aquino had taken one look at and redirected him to a tailor in the supernatural district who had done something to the shoulders and the hem that Issei could not exactly describe but that had resulted in something that fit correctly rather than adequately. He had thanked her. She had said, with the smile that was beginning to feel less like armor and more like genuine warmth, that looking like someone who belonged in a room was a form of intelligence gathering in its own right. Hayuka walked beside him in her social projection, a composed young woman with silver white hair and winter sky eyes, the horn present but subdued, easily overlooked by anyone who was not specifically looking for it. She had explained, before they arrived, that her social projection was not a disguise. It was simply one of several true forms, the one designed for interaction with beings who found her full appearance disconcerting. The intent reading operated identically in either form. He had noted this distinction between disguise and true form, and found it informative about how she understood herself. The gathering was approximately 40 beings in attendance, a mixture of devil nobility, their associated peerage members, and several neutral parties whose presence was presumably social rather than political. The conversation moved in the patterns of any social event where business is conducted under the surface of pleasantries, carefully calibrated statements, the exchange of implications rather than direct information, the constant low-level assessment of who was aligned with whom. Issei was, in all honesty, not entirely comfortable in this environment. He was good at reading people and direct interaction, but large social gatherings produced a volume of simultaneous data that his organizational mind found taxing. He could feel the index cards in his mental board filling up faster than he could process and categorize them. He managed by focusing on his primary objective and treating everything else as background. Northern Cluster, Hayuka said quietly beside him, at a volume only he could hear. 3 members of the Phoenix Peerage, including the Bishop twins. Their body language relative to each other is companionable, but their body language relative to the room is closed. They are here because they are expected to be, not because they wish to be. Is that useful? Context. The question of whether their commitment to Riser is genuine or performed is better assessed when Riser is present. At the moment he is not. He arrives in approximately 20 minutes if his social patterns hold, Issei said. He had researched this as well. Then we have 20 minutes. She tilted her head very slightly. The younger bishop daughter is watching you. He did not look toward her immediately. He moved through the room with Hayuka, accepting a glass of something that looked like water and was probably not, and allowed another 7 minutes to pass before he positioned himself in the younger twins' likely conversational field. Ravel Phoenix was 14 years old and composed with the particular composure of someone who has been taught to present composure regardless of what lies beneath it. She was pretty in the way that suggested her actual appearance had not yet caught up with what it was going to be, with cheekbones and eyes that seemed slightly large for her current face and that would, in a few years, produce something remarkable. She was watching the room with a quality of attention that reminded him, with a small start, of his own. She was cataloging. When he met her eyes, she did not look away. She assessed him with the directness of someone who has decided that the performance of social interaction is less interesting than the thing itself. You're with the Gremry Peerage, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Issei Hayadu, Ravel Phoenix. A pause. You're the one my brother mentioned. Something in his attention sharpened. He mentioned me? He said the Gremry girl had picked up a human with a sacred gear who thought he was a strategist. Her voice was even, but something behind it was doing its own assessment. He said it in the tone he uses when something has surprised him, and he doesn't want to admit it. Issei looked at her. She looked back. They were both, he thought, having the same realization about each other. What do you think? He asked. About whether you're a strategist? About whether the Gremry Peerage is worth paying attention to. Ravel was quiet for a moment. She looked at the room, at the conversational clusters and the careful social distances, at the performance of supernatural politics operating in every direction. I think, she said finally, that Rias Gremry has made choices that most people have described as sentimental, and that the same people have been surprised by the outcomes of those choices. And that being surprised by the same person more than once suggests the assessment of sentimentality was incorrect. A pause. And I think that my brother has not updated his model of her peerage since he formed it 3 years ago, which is a problem, because the peerage has changed considerably in the past 6 weeks. Issei looked at her with the same quality of attention she was directing at him. You've been paying attention, he said. I pay attention to everything, she said. No one in my household considers it notable because no one considers my assessments worth acting on. She said it without self-pity, The flat delivery of a fact that has been verified repeatedly, and no longer produces the accompanying emotion. He recognized this quality. He had met it before, in different forms, in every person he had recruited in the past 6 weeks. That seems like a significant waste, he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not the composure. Beneath the composure. Before she could respond, a change moved through the room in the way that changes move through rooms where one person's presence reorders everything else around it. Riser Phoenix had arrived. Riser moved through the gathering with the ease of someone who has never walked into a room and doubted his right to occupy it. He acknowledged several attendees with the graduated attention of someone who maintains a precise mental ranking of social significance. He accepted a drink. He smiled at 2 separate people with the kind of smile that is actually a statement about hierarchy rather than an expression of warmth. He found Issei at the 12-minute mark. Or rather, Issei had positioned himself to be found at approximately the 12-minute mark, having watched Riser's circulation pattern establish itself and extrapolated its continuation. He was standing near the window that Riser's pattern would bring him past, in a position that was visible without being conspicuous, with Hayaka maintaining a discreet distance and her intent reading fully operational. The Gremry peerage sent a representative, Riser said, to the middle distance rather than to Issei directly, which was the social technique of someone who wishes to make a statement without technically addressing anyone. How considerate. Issei Hayadu, Issei said. I'm the peerage strategist. A fractional pause. Not long enough to be visible to most observers. Long enough for Issei, who had been watching for it. Strategist, Riser repeated. The word carried the particular weight of someone testing whether the container matches its label. Is that an unfamiliar term? The smile did not flicker, but something behind Riser's eyes recalculated. Issei noted this with the quiet recognition of someone who has found, in a real object, a shape he had only previously known from descriptions. The Gremry girl has always been a sentimental player, Riser said. She collects strays and assigns them roles that sound important. It's an endearing quality. I'm familiar with that assessment, Issei said. I think it's incomplete. Do you? The beings you describe as strays have capabilities that your peerage cannot currently match in specific domains. Wind pressure column construction that functionally negates conventional ranged attack strategies. Long-range intent detection that operates in monitored environments without triggering standard surveillance countermeasures. Distributed sensory coordination that removes the information gap your formation relies on. He held Riser's gaze without effort. I'm not describing theoretical capabilities. I'm describing demonstrated ones, which means they will appear in our next game in ways your current defensive doctrine doesn't account for. Riser looked at him with the assessing expression of someone recalibrating. That is either the confidence of someone who knows something, he said slowly, or the confidence of someone who doesn't know what they don't know. I'd say both are possible, Issei agreed. The game will determine which. Yes, Riser said. It will. And the weight in it was genuine, not the social performance of a threat, but the real thing beneath it. I look forward to it, Issei said. They looked at each other for a moment in the way that 2 people who have just understood something about each other look at each other when the understanding is not entirely welcome to either party. Then Riser moved on, and the conversation ended, and Issei exhaled slowly and went to find Hayaka. She was in the eastern alcove, in the shadow of a doorway, and her expression when he reached her was the one he had come to identify as the closest she came to wearing concern openly. That, she said quietly, was not the plan. No. You revealed yourself as a strategic actor before the game. The advantage of his uncertainty about our capabilities has been reduced. Yes. You know this. I know this. He was quiet for a moment. He was dismissive of Zeph and Hayaka and everyone I've been working with for 6 weeks. Not strategically dismissive. Personally dismissive. The kind that doesn't actually see them. A long pause. Hayaka said, with a quality in her voice that was not quite gentle and not quite something else. You could not let it stand. I made a tactical error for a non-tactical reason, he said. I'll account for it. You will. She turned back to the room. What I observed of Riser's peerage dynamics. His bishops have genuine affection for each other, and a kind of fond tolerance for him that falls short of loyalty. His queen's commitment is professional and deep and complex, more layered than pure obligation, but with a condition I cannot fully read from this distance. It is not hollow. A pause. He will fight for his formation out of pride. She will fight for it because she believes in it. These are different motivations and they produce different behavior under pressure. Which behavior breaks first? Pride, she said without hesitation. Pride is a motivation that requires the world to cooperate with its narrative. It does not adapt well to sustained surprise. Issei looked at the room, at Reiser in conversation near the center, at Ravel who had returned to her position near the northern cluster, and was watching the room with those large careful eyes. The younger sister, he said. She is not happy, Hayaka said simply. Not in the way of someone who is temporarily unhappy. In the way of someone who has not had that particular kind of intelligence valued for a long time. He thought about this on the walk back to the Gremery residence, through the cool autumn night with Hayaka walking beside him in her social projection. He thought about what it meant to have a capability that the people around you could not see. He had an updated plan to write. Chapter 9, 5 Weeks of Becoming. Training began the next morning. Not the training the peerage had done before, which had been individual practice conducted in parallel, each member working on their own capabilities in their own way with no particular relationship to what anyone else was doing at the same time. This was something different. Issei had spent 3 days building the training schedule, not as a series of individual sessions but as an integrated program where each day's work built on the previous days and fed into the next one, where the individual capability work and the coordination work were not separate concerns but aspects of the same developing picture. He called it simply the schedule, because naming it something more impressive would have made it sound like something other than what it was, which was a very large amount of deliberate practice organized in a specific order for specific reasons. The first week was the hardest. Individual training was familiar. Everyone in the peerage had been doing it, in their various forms, for years. What was unfamiliar was the coordination drilling, the exercises designed not to develop individual capabilities but to develop the relationships between them. Timing exercises. Communication protocols. Positional awareness drills where the goal was not to win an engagement but to understand, at any moment, where every other member of the peerage was and what they were doing. This is humbling, Kiba said, on the 4th day, sitting on the training ground with his sword across his knees and an expression that mixed genuine engagement with a sort of bemused exhaustion. How so? I have been training for years. I am confident in my individual capability. He looked at the training ground, at the markers that Issei had set out to indicate positions and timing windows. I have just discovered that I cannot reliably estimate where Akino is in a shared space at high speed unless I'm watching her directly. That's why we're drilling it. I understand why we're drilling it. I'm saying that discovering I can't do something I assumed I could do is humbling. Issei sat beside him. Every person in this peerage is going to find something in the next 5 weeks that they cannot do as well as they thought. That's not a problem. That's the training working. The point of the coordination drilling is to find the gaps before the game does. Kiba was quiet for a moment. Then, what gap have you found in yourself? I can model positions accurately in static scenarios. I struggle to maintain the full picture in real time when more than 4 things are happening simultaneously. I have a cognitive bottleneck at around the 5 variable mark. He said it without apparent discomfort. Which is why the communication protocols have to be tight enough that I'm not being given information. I'm being given signals that I've pre-assigned meaning to, so the processing load at my end is reduced to pattern recognition rather than interpretation. Kiba looked at him. You've already designed around your own limitation. It would be strange to account for everyone else's and not my own. A pause. Is that why you give everyone very specific code words rather than descriptions? Yes. If Hayaka says Eastern approach, rapid movement, alone, that's 3 things for me to process. If Hayaka says Delta 3, that's one thing, because I've built the pre-assignment well enough that Delta 3 already means single high-priority piece moving fast toward the Eastern approach. Less processing time, lower error rate. Kiba was quiet for a long moment, turning this over. You've been building this system, he said finally, since before you had a game to apply it to. I've been building it since I understood what the plan needed. The game is the application. The system is the infrastructure. Kiba paused, searching for the right word, a particular way to think. It's the only way I know, Issei said, and this was entirely true. The second week introduced what Issei privately called the trust exercises, though he did not call them this to the peerage because the phrase had a slightly therapeutic quality that he suspected would cause Kaneko to leave the room. The principle was straightforward. Most of the coordination failures in the historical game records he had analyzed were not failures of capability, or even of timing. They were failures of trust. A piece that doubted the plan would hedge their movement, creating a small deviation from the intended position. The deviation propagated through the sequence, because every other piece's position had been calculated relative to the expected position of the doubting piece. By the time the sequence reached its critical moment, the architecture had drifted far enough from the intended shape that the intended outcome was no longer achievable. The trust required was not blind. He was not asking anyone to follow the plan because he said so. He was asking them to follow the plan because they understood it well enough to trust its logic, and to communicate clearly and quickly if their understanding failed so the plan could be adjusted rather than silently degraded. This was a more demanding thing to ask than it appeared. It required everyone to be willing to say, in real time, that they did not understand or did not agree. Which required a relationship between the planner and the pieces that was not the standard relationship of superior to subordinate. He had thought about this a great deal before the training began. He had concluded that the only way to build the required relationship was to be demonstrably honest about his own uncertainty, his own limitations, and his own reasoning, so that the others could evaluate his decisions rather than simply receiving them. This was, several peerage members told him at various points in the second week, not how strategy briefings usually worked. Standard doctrine, Aquino told him on a Wednesday morning, sitting across from him with a cup of tea warming her hands, is for the strategist to project absolute confidence, and for the pieces to trust that confidence without seeing the underlying work. I know. I've read the doctrine. And you've decided not to follow it. I've decided it produces the wrong kind of trust. Confidence trust is fragile. The moment the plan runs into unexpected resistance, pieces who were trusting the planner's confidence start to doubt the confidence, and then they have no basis for continuing to follow the plan because they never understood why the plan was the plan. He looked at her. I want logic trust. You follow the plan because you can see the logic, and you've verified it. If the logic holds under the unexpected resistance, you continue. If the logic is invalidated, you tell me so immediately and we adapt. Aquino looked at him for a long time. That requires you to share the logic in enough detail that we can actually verify it. Yes. Which means the briefings need to be longer and more detailed than standard doctrine. Significantly? Yes. And you need to be honest about the parts you're less certain of. Also yes. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her tea. How long did you spend on this question before you started the program? 3 days, he said. There's a literature on organizational trust in non-supernatural human strategy contexts that I found useful. You read human management literature, she said, with a tone that was somewhere between surprised and delighted. It translates reasonably well. She laughed, and it was the real one again. Kaneko came to him on the Tuesday of the third week. He was in the club room doing position calculations when she appeared in the doorway with the particular quality of presence that she had, the quality of something that has been there slightly longer than you realized and has decided, after consideration, to make itself known. The 15%, she said. He waited. She came into the room and sat across from him, and was quiet for a moment, looking at the table between them with her usual economy of expression. I hold it back because of my sister, she said finally. Kuroka. She lost control. Her power expanded beyond what she could contain, and she hurt people. She killed someone. A pause. Someone who did not deserve it. The weight of the words sat between them. I am afraid, Kaneko continued, in the flat voice that was not the absence of feeling but the deliberate management of it, that the same thing happens to me if I stop managing it. If I let the ceiling go and the power expands the way it expanded in her. Do you have evidence that it would? He asked carefully. I have evidence that it happened once to someone with the same bloodline. That's a sample size of one from a different person in different circumstances. I know that intellectually. The intellectual knowledge doesn't reduce the fear. No. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm not going to ask you to release the limiter. That's your decision, and it's made for reasons that deserve respect. He met her eyes. What I want to understand is where the ceiling actually sits. Not in terms of power output. In terms of what you can do comfortably, with full confidence, without any internal conflict about whether you're managing correctly. She looked at him. Why does that matter if the ceiling doesn't move? Because the plan should be built around what you can actually give, not around an estimate of what you can give. If I design a sequence that requires you to output at 90% when you're comfortable at 85%, the sequence will fail by exactly that margin, every time, in the ways that matter most. He paused. I'd rather have 85% of Kaneko Toujours, absolutely reliable, than 100% of an idea of Kaneko Toujours that doesn't exist. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, my sister didn't have anyone who tried to build around her instead of through her. He was not sure what to say to that, so he said nothing, which was sometimes the correct choice. After a while Kaneko said, show me the part of the plan where my ceiling matters. The actual numbers. He opened the notebook and showed her. They spent 2 hours working through it together, with her providing precise information about what she could sustain and for how long and under what conditions, and him adjusting the plan architecture accordingly. It was, he thought afterward, the most productive 2 hours of the 5-week training period. Not because the adjustments were large. Because the adjustments were made by someone who actually knew rather than by someone estimating, and the difference between knowing and estimating was the difference between a plan that would hold under pressure and one that would fray at exactly the moment it mattered most. The 4th week introduced Zephyrine specialized training. He had been working with her individually since she joined the peerage, but the 4th week's training was different. It was the first time he asked her to practice the pressure column application in coordination with Kiba's movement patterns, because the northern engagement zone role required them to be precisely synchronized. The first attempt produced 3 consecutive failures. Zephyrine's pressure columns were effective, but their timing had been calibrated for solo application. Kiba's movement through the affected zone required her to create and dissolve the columns in a sequence that was half a second faster than her natural application rhythm. The result was 3 instances where the column timing was slightly off, producing a boundary inconsistency that would, in an actual game, have left a window that an attentive opponent could exploit. He watched the 3rd failure carefully, and then called a rest. The problem is the rhythm mismatch, he said, to both of them. Zeph's natural application cadence is slightly slower than Kiba's movement cadence. Either Kiba slows by a controlled amount, which reduces his effectiveness in the sector, or Zeph accelerates her rhythm, which requires adjustment to the application technique. He looked at Zephyrine. What would it take to accelerate the application rhythm? She thought about it. She had the focused quality of someone who takes problems seriously. The column construction starts from a ground reference point. The ground reference creates latency before the column can establish its vertical extent. If I shift to an aerial reference point instead, the latency reduces. The column is slightly less stable at the base, but the timing is faster by approximately the amount you need. Trade-off? An aerial reference column has a variance of about 3 degrees in its horizontal alignment. Not enough to matter unless the opponent is specifically trying to move through the exact column edge. That's an acceptable variance. He looked at Kiba. Does 3 degrees of column alignment variance change anything in your movement path? No. I know the general zone. 3 degrees doesn't affect the route. Then let's run it with the aerial reference. Zeph, walk me through the adjustment before we practice it so we're all clear on what you're changing. She walked them through it, precisely and without hesitation, in the way of someone who has been waiting for someone to ask the right question. They ran the sequence 4 more times. The 4th was clean. Kiba looked at her afterward with an expression that was uncomplicated and genuine. That was excellent, he said. Zephyrine looked slightly uncertain about what to do with the direct compliment. She managed a nod and looked away, and Issei noted this and noted the context, and added it to his understanding of what she needed that the world had not been providing. Asia's training was the one he was most careful about. She had not been a combat participant in the conventional sense before joining the peerage, and he had no intention of asking her to become one now. Her role in the plan was specifically designed around what she actually was, a healer of extraordinary precision and range, with the patience and calm under pressure that came from having maintained her faith and her kindness through circumstances that would have corroded both. What he needed from her was speed and triage logic. In a game situation, he explained, in the first dedicated session with her, you will have moments where multiple pieces need attention simultaneously. The instinct will be to go to whoever is most severely injured. I need you to override that instinct with a different calculation. Asia looked at him carefully. Which calculation? Whose recovery returns the most strategic value to the current phase of the plan? A piece at 50% effectiveness in the right position is worth more than a piece at 100% effectiveness in the wrong position. He paused. This means sometimes you will leave a more severely injured piece to recover someone who is less injured but more critically positioned. I know that's a difficult call. Asia was quiet for a moment. She had the quality of giving difficult things the attention they deserved before responding to them. I understand the logic, she said finally. I want to ask about the cases where the calculation produces an outcome I cannot accept in good conscience. What cases would those be? If someone is in immediate danger of being removed from the game entirely, and my calculation says to prioritize someone else, but going to the endangered piece would prevent an irreversible outcome. The math might say one thing and the person says another. He looked at her. That's a real conflict. I don't want to paper over it. No. My answer is, use your judgment. The triage calculation I'm teaching you is a tool, not a mandate. If you see something the tool doesn't account for, the tool is wrong. I need you to understand the calculation well enough to know when to use it, and when to override it. Asia looked at him for a long moment. That's different from what I expected you to say, she said. What did you expect? That the plan came first. The plan serves the people. If it stops doing that in a specific moment, the moment matters more than the plan. She smiled, and it was the Asia smile, the one that was entirely unsophisticated and entirely genuine and carried, somehow, more warmth than most things. I think, she said, that I understand what you're building. Good, he said. Now let's practice the triage timing. Chapter 10. What the Pieces Carry. On the 18th day of training, Rios cancelled the afternoon session. She did not explain why. She told the peerage that the afternoon was free, that individual rest and personal time were part of any functional training program, and that she would see everyone at dinner. Her expression was composed but carried the quality that Issei had learned to identify as the presentation she deployed when something internal was demanding attention that she did not want to give it in public. He did not ask. He went to the roof instead, which had become his default thinking space since the morning Aquino had brought him tea there, and he sat with his notebook and tried to do productive work and found that the work was not coming as smoothly as usual. He sat with this for a while. Then he went looking for Rios. He found her in the club room, alone, sitting at the head of the table with a letter open in front of her. Not a supernatural communication document. An actual letter, handwritten on cream paper with a formal seal at the top that he recognized as the Phoenix House crest. She looked up when he came in. She did not put the letter away. Training? She asked. Finished the morning session. The afternoon is free, you said? It is. Are you all right? She looked at him with the expression that preceded honesty when she chose it. The Phoenix household sent a timeline, she said. For the engagement. There are conditions attached to the rating game outcome that I had not previously been told. What conditions? If the game is completed but I lose, the engagement formalization is accelerated. The original terms gave me until my graduation. The revised terms do not. She folded the letter with the careful, deliberate motion of someone performing calm rather than feeling it. It appears someone in the Phoenix household has decided that the rating game represents a risk rather than a formality. Someone expected us to forfeit, Issei said. Or to decline to play. That was probably the expectation, yes? He sat down across from her. We're not going to lose. I know, she said. You've told me this. You believe it. I don't believe it the way people believe things they want to be true. I believe it the way I believe that a specific sequence of moves will produce a specific outcome if executed correctly, because I can show the logic. He paused. The logic is solid. The team is ready. We're not going to lose. Rias looked at him for a long time. Issei. Her voice was quieter than usual. When you designed the plan? When you built everything we've been training? Was any part of it? Did any part of it involve? She stopped. What? Did you design the plan to win the game, or to resolve the engagement? He understood the question. He sat with it honestly before answering. I designed the plan to win the game, he said. The engagement situation informed how seriously I treated the importance of winning. But the plan itself is a game plan. It doesn't address anything beyond the game. Because the engagement is mine to navigate. Because the engagement is yours to navigate. Yes. She looked at the folded letter on the table. I have been building this peerage, she said, for 4 years. Not as a political tool. Not as a demonstration. Because I believed, without quite being able to articulate why, that the beings I was choosing deserved to be seen clearly. That the value they had was real and not approximate, and not charity. A pause. And then you arrived, and in 6 weeks you built a system that proves it. That makes it demonstrable rather than just something I believed. He was quiet. He did not know what to say that would not diminish what she was saying. The rating game machinery, she continued, is built on the premise that value is measurable by the right metrics, and that the current metrics are correct. I have spent 4 years quietly disagreeing. You have spent 6 weeks building the argument. The argument works because the peerage is what you built it to be, he said carefully. I identified the capabilities. You chose the people. She looked at him. You keep doing that, she said. Doing what? Redirecting credit. I'm accurately attributing causation. Or you are someone who is not comfortable accepting the full weight of what they've built. This landed with the slight discomfort of an accurate observation. Perhaps both, he said. She smiled. It was the small, genuine one. Perhaps both, she agreed. She stood and went to the window, looking out at the late afternoon light on the school grounds. From behind, with her hair catching the light and her posture carrying the complicated weight of someone who is many things at once, she looked like the person Issei was beginning to understand she actually was rather than any single one of the roles she wore. 5 weeks tomorrow, she said. 4 more days of training. And then the game. And then the game. She turned back from the window. I'd like to request something. Of course. The night before the game. A full peerage dinner. All of us, together, nothing about strategy, or timing or contingency branches. Just the people. He looked at her. You think that's tactically important? I think it's humanly important. Which is, in my experience, the more durable kind. He thought about this for a moment. Yes, he said. That's a good idea. She held his gaze for one more moment with an expression he still did not entirely know how to catalog. Good, she said. I'll cook. He blinked. You cook? He said. I cook extremely well, she said, with the dignity of someone who considers this a significant statement. Close the door on your way out. I have a menu to plan. Chapter 11, The Shape of a Team. Kiba found him in the training ground at 10 in the evening on the 22nd day, long after the scheduled session had ended and the rest of the peerage had returned to the residence. He had come back for individual practice, which was how he spent most evenings that didn't have scheduled work, moving through sword forms with the precision and attention that suggested he was not drilling for speed or power but for something more internal. He stopped when he heard Issei's footsteps and turned with the reflexive alertness of someone whose body had been trained to notice everything. You don't have to stop, Issei said. I know. Kiba sheathed his sword and sat down at the edge of the training ground. I was thinking anyway. The practice was something to do while thinking. Issei sat beside him. The night was clear and the training ground was lit by the residence lights and the half-moon. Somewhere in the residence, he could hear faint sounds that might have been Akino playing the piano, which she did occasionally in the evenings in a way that was not performance, but a private thing that she had been permitting the peerage to overhear. What were you thinking about? He asked. Kiba was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone organizing something that has been living in pieces rather than as a whole. I was thinking about the plan, he said. Specifically the Sector 5 position. The one where I passed the rook without engaging. The instinct override. Yes. He looked at the training ground. I've been running it in my head. Every time I run it, the same thing happens. I reach the rook, My body wants to engage, and there's a moment where I have to actively choose not to. Is the choice difficult? It was difficult at first. Now it's just a choice. I've made it enough times in practice that it's become a known choice rather than a surprise. But I wanted to tell you that the transition from a surprise to a known choice was not immediate. It took 10 iterations before I stopped having to fight it. Why are you telling me this? Kiba looked at him. Because you asked me to communicate when I was uncertain. And for the first 10 iterations I was uncertain. I'm not uncertain now. But you should know the interval. Issei looked at him for a moment. Thank you, he said. That's exactly the kind of information I need. It felt strange to report, Kiba admitted. Reporting a resolved uncertainty. I almost didn't. I'm glad you did. Resolved uncertainty is useful data. It tells me how long the transition period is for that kind of override, which informs how early I need to introduce similar overrides in future training. Kiba considered this. Everything becomes data for the next plan. Everything is either data or noise. I try to reduce the noise. A pause. Then Kiba said, Can I ask what you were like before all this? Before you were the peerage's strategist. Before the reincarnation. Issei was quiet for a moment. Quieter, he said. Less purposeful. I had the same thinking quality. The same organizational tendency. But no application for it beyond school, which was not very demanding, and a general sense that I was observing a world that didn't particularly need what I was observing. And now I have an application. He paused. I also have people whose outcomes are connected to what I do, which is both more demanding and more meaningful than anything I had before. Does it frighten you? Yes, he said without hesitation. Constantly. The fear is that I'll get the plan wrong in a way I could have gotten right. That the error will be mine and the cost will be someone else's. He looked at the training ground. I manage it by making the plan as good as I can and being honest about where it's weakest. That's all I can do. Kiba was quiet for a long time after this. Then he said, with a directness that was characteristic of him when he chose to abandon the careful social manner, I think you're a good strategist. Not because the plan is clever, though it is. Because you built it around who we actually are rather than who you needed us to be. Issei looked at him. Thank you, he said. That's the most important thing anyone could say about the plan. They sat for a while in the evening quiet, with the kino's distant piano and the moonlight and the training ground that had held 4 weeks of becoming, and neither of them found it necessary to say anything more for a considerable time. On the morning of the 24th day, Akino found a letter slipped under the club room door. It was not addressed. It did not have a seal. It was written in a very small, very precise hand on plain cream paper, and when Akino read it her expression went through several changes before settling on something thoughtful. She brought it to Issei. He read it twice. The letter said, in its small precise hand, the eastern approach route through the maintenance corridor is not in the standard game terrain documentation, but it exists in the actual implementation. 3 meters wider than the North Passage. Better for large wingspan flight. This is offered because I find the concept of a peerage built around underestimated capabilities to be philosophically interesting. No response is required or expected. There was no signature. Issei thought about Ravel Phoenix at the gathering, watching him with those large careful eyes. Someone from the Phoenix household, Akino said. Almost certainly. That's either a very kind thing or a trap. I know. The information is verifiable independently. I'll check it against the terrain documentation. He folded the letter. If it's accurate, it's the kind of specific detail that doesn't appear in standard documentation. Which means it came from someone with inside knowledge who wanted us to have it. Why would someone in the Phoenix household want us to win? Issei thought about the flat voice describing having one's assessments consistently dismissed. About a girl with cataloging eyes standing in a corner of a room, watching and being watched by no one. Not us winning, necessarily, he said. Something being demonstrated. Akino looked at him for a long moment. You know who sent it. I have a strong hypothesis, he said. Which I intend to verify independently and not act on until it's verified. Very responsible, she said, with a faint smile. The information checks out or it doesn't. If it does, it goes into the plan. The source doesn't change the validity. And if it's a trap? Then we've identified a deviation from expected opponent behavior that requires a plan adjustment. Which is still useful information. Aquino shook her head slowly. You are, she said, genuinely unusual. I've been told this before. I say it as a compliment. He checked the terrain documentation. The eastern approach maintenance corridor was exactly as described, 3 meters wider than listed, with approach angles that were, as Zephyrin confirmed when he asked her, significantly better suited to large wingspan flight patterns than the documented route. He updated the plan. Chapter 12, The Dinner and the Distance. The dinner was on a Friday evening, the night before the last full training day. Rias cooked, which turned out to mean that Rias cooked with the focused intensity of someone for whom cooking is a practice rather than a task. She spent the afternoon in the kitchen and declined all offers of assistance with a politeness that was, Issei assessed, a form of the same thing as the roof time he took for himself, a space where the role fell away and the person could simply be engaged with something they found genuinely absorbing. The result was a table loaded with enough food to suggest she had found the process therapeutic, and 7 people arranged around it in the evening light with the comfortable ease of beings who have been working together closely enough that the social performance has worn away, and something more actual has replaced it. Zephyrin ate with the focused appreciation of someone who had spent 40 years eating what she could find rather than what she wanted. She had developed, over the weeks in the residence, a particular relationship with Kaneko that Issei had noted with some satisfaction. 2 people who communicated primarily through economy and precision and had discovered in each other a compatible language. Hyuka ate little and observed much, which was her characteristic mode. She had settled into the peerage's social texture not as a full participant but as a presence, which was, Issei had come to understand, a significant statement from a being who had spent decades declining to participate in anything. Asia asked Kiba about his sword practice with the genuine curiosity she brought to everything, and he answered with more words than he usually spent on personal topics, and Aquino watched this with the expression she wore when something made her privately pleased. Aquino herself was, Issei noted, slightly different tonight. The warmth as armor quality that usually characterized her social presence was still there, but the gap between the presentation and whatever was beneath it was smaller than usual. She looked like someone who had been wearing a heavy coat for a long time and had recently discovered, to her cautious surprise, that the room was warm enough not to need it. Issei sat at his end of the table and watched all of this, and felt something he did not immediately know how to label. Rias caught his expression at one point and raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He considered. "That I have never in my life had a table to sit at like this one," he said. The table went quiet in the way of people who have heard something honest and are deciding how to hold it. Then Kaneko said, "Either have any of us," and ate a piece of sweet potato, and the quiet resolved into something that was not quite the same as it had been before but was better. After dinner, when the table had been cleared and Rias had produced tea and the peerage had spread across the comfortable furniture of the club room in the arrangement that had become habitual over 6 weeks, Issei sat near the window and watched the city lights and allowed himself to simply be present in the room without doing anything useful. This was harder than it sounded. His mind did not easily idle. The board was always there, always arranging and rearranging, and the habit of usefulness was deeply enough ingrained that simply sitting felt like a small act of resistance against his own nature. But Rias had said, the people, not the strategy. And she had been right, as she was about a number of things he had initially filed as secondary. Aquino sat down beside him. She did not bring tea this time, which was slightly unusual. She brought herself and a blanket that she spread across her knees with the self-possessed comfort of someone who has decided to be comfortable rather than performing composure. "Good dinner," she said. "Excellent dinner. I had no idea she cooked." "There are many things Rias Bucho does that aren't in the file you've been building," Aquino said, with the warmth that was increasingly just warmth rather than armor. "She plays the violin. She paints, though she hasn't in some time. She has a very strong opinion about the correct way to steep green tea that she has communicated to me on multiple occasions despite my continued indifference to the question. I didn't know any of that." "No. You know her strategically. There's more." He thought about this. "Is this a suggestion that I should expand the picture? It's an observation that the picture is incomplete, Aquino said. What you do with that is entirely up to you. She smiled at him, the real one, and looked out at the city lights, and did not press the point, which was, Issei thought, its own kind of eloquence. Across the room, Rias was showing Zephyrine something in a book, and Zeph's wings were slightly extended in the way that meant she was genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement, and the lamplight made the whole scene look like something from a painting, everything warm and particular and momentary. He would remember this later, with the clarity that important things acquire in retrospect. The dinner and the lamplight and the sound of Aquino's breathing beside him and the way Rias laughed at something Zeph said, genuinely, unexpectedly, the Real laugh. He would remember it as the night the peerage stopped being a strategic architecture and became, fully and without reservation, his people. Chapter 13, the night before the game. The raiding game was scheduled for a Saturday, beginning at noon. On Friday evening, Issei sat at the table alone after everyone had gone to sleep, going over the plan for the last time. He had a practice of reviewing the complete architecture on the night before a significant event, not looking for new things to add but checking the coherence of what already existed. Every decision tree. Every contingency branch. Every position and timing and the connections between them. He moved through it the way a builder moves through a structure they've spent months constructing, not looking for new problems but confirming the solidity of what they've built, the security of each joint, the reliability of each load-bearing element. It took 2 hours. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the cards on the table and felt the particular stillness of something that had been completed. Not finished because the game itself would require real-time adjustment, and nothing planned is ever executed without deviation. But complete in the sense of having been thought through as thoroughly as he was capable of thinking it through. He had done what he could do. He sat with this for a while. Then the door opened. Rias came in at 11:30, wearing the loose sweater over pajamas, her hair down, the formality entirely absent. She looked at him across the table with the expression she reserved for moments of deliberate honesty. You should sleep, she said. I just finished. She sat down. Not at the far end. Across from him, close enough that the lamplight fell equally on both of them. Tell me truly, she said. What do you believe our chances are? We will win, he said. I've told you this. You've told me the logic. I'm asking what you feel. He considered this distinction. I feel that we will win, he said. Which is unusual for me, because feeling and analysis generally produce different outputs and I default to the analysis. But in this case they align. The plan is the best I can build. The peerage is the best prepared they can be with the time we had. The capabilities we've assembled are genuinely novel against this specific opponent. All of that is true. A pause. But the part that makes me feel rather than just know is the team. They're ready in a way that isn't just technical preparation. They're ready in the way that matters when things stop following the plan. Rias looked at him for a long time. You've been doing something, she said, that I did not anticipate when I agreed to the arrangement you proposed in the courtyard. What? I thought you would build a system, she said. I thought you would design something impressive and mechanical that used us as components. And you did build a system. But the system is. She searched for the word. Personal. It's built out of who we actually are. It's built around what Kaneko carries and what Seth needs and what Kiba is still becoming and what Aquino is underneath the performance. And that is not. Another pause. That is not what I expected from a strategist. What did you expect? Someone who understood positions. You understand people. He was quiet for a moment. They're the same thing, he said. On the board, a position is defined by what occupies it. Understanding a position means understanding what occupies it. I cannot plan around people I don't understand. So I had to understand you. All of us. All of you. She looked at the table. At the cards, at the notation, at 5 weeks of careful work assembled into something that would either hold or wouldn't in approximately 12 hours. Issei, she said. The engagement situation. Between me and Riser. You don't have to discuss it. I know. I want to. She held his gaze. When I was told about the engagement originally, I was young enough that I did not fully understand what it meant. By the time I understood, I had already begun building the peerage, and the peerage became the thing I chose rather than the thing I was given. The engagement was the world insisting on a different story. I have been, for 4 years, quietly insisting back. The game is part of the insistence. Winning the game demonstrates that the path I chose was correct. That the peerage I built, the choices I made, the beings I selected when I was told each one was a mistake, produced something real. Something that cannot be dismissed as sentimental or incorrect. It will, and after that, she said quietly, I will have to make other choices. The engagement does not dissolve with a game result. There are family considerations and political considerations and my own heart, which is not a simple thing to navigate. He listened. I am not telling you this because I need strategy, she said. I am telling you because tomorrow is important to me in ways that go beyond the game, and you are the person who has been building toward tomorrow with me, and I wanted you to know the full weight of what you've been building. He sat with this for a moment. I know, he said. I've known since Hayaka described the engagement context. I didn't bring it up because it isn't a strategic problem. It's yours to navigate. But I've known. And it didn't change how you built the plan? It made me more careful. Not in the way of building something for a reason other than winning the game. In the way of, this matters completely, so make it good. Rias looked at him. The lamplight was steady and the night was quiet, and the table between them held the architecture of 5 weeks of becoming. I am very glad, she said very quietly, that you counter-proposed from a courtyard. So am I, he said. More every day. Something in her expression shifted, just briefly, towards something that neither of them named. Then she straightened and was again the Grandmaster, composed and ready, wearing the role with the grace of long practice. Sleep, she said. The plan is good. The team is ready. The rest belongs to tomorrow. She stood. She moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused without turning around. Issei. Yes. Whatever happens after the game. Whatever the family negotiations produce or don't produce. I want you to know that the peerage you've helped build is the one I chose. Every piece of it. She left. He sat at the table for a long time after, with the stillness of someone sitting with something they do not quite know how to hold yet but are learning. Then he went to sleep. On the board behind his closed eyes, every piece was in its place. They were ready. End of Act 2.